Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the boundaries of magic in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 11, Strange Plots. Evening was rapidly approaching as thunder rumbled in the distance and old wood creaked against the forces of the water. In the middle of the ocean, squeezed in uncomfortable between stacks of crates in the belly of a trade ship, two young men and a woman sat leaned over a sloppily scribbled map on a parchment no larger than two, perhaps three open hands held side by side, as a magical orb of pure white light hovered in the air above their heads. "Did you truly pay 200 gold for this?" Constance asked in dismay after attempting for the umpteenth time to interpret the scribbles of the sailor Linhard had apparently paid to draw him a map of the entire continent of Morphais. "It's better than nothing," Linhard argued, pointing to an unevenly drawn rectangle at the top of the so-called map. "Look, the city is up here." "Yes," she said wearily, "but what good is the mere knowledge that the city exists when the map tells us nothing of how to find it?" At that, Linhard moved his finger downward, pausing at a confusing swirly shape before moving to the left, muttering something inaudible below his breath as he frowned. Constance sighed. Clearly Linhard could not interpret the thing either. "It's fine," the man sitting on the other side of Linhard said, causing her to glance furtively in his direction. "At least we know it's in the east. We'll just head in that general direction, and ask someone to guide us right if we get lost. Always worked for me before." Constance pursed her lips and leaned back, opting to stay silent as the two men continued discussing the subject of navigation. While Linhard seemed to have already accepted Shay into their party, few to no questions asked, she was much more hesitant to trust this mysterious stranger. After she had regained her composure from her most recent episode and after she and Linhard had agreed to postpone the next therapy session until they had solid ground beneath their feet, they had questioned the stranger on his aims, first and foremost in order to determine whether he seemed trustworthy or not. If he couldn't explain his presence on the ship in a satisfactory way, they would have to assume that he was there to spy on them, perhaps as one of Thales's spies. The explanation given by the other man had been surprising, to say the least. After much awkward and clearly avoidant blathering, he had admitted that he was a mercenary on his way to Morphais in hope of finding clues that would aid him in his self-discovery. Upon being pressed by Constance to elaborate further as to what exactly that self-discovery entailed, he had reluctantly told them that strange powers had manifested within him several years ago, and that he hadn't yet been able to learn much about those powers or where they came from. And then recently, he had found a clue that had pointed him in the direction of Morphais. At this point in his explanation, Linhard had perked up and asked what those strange powers were, and if they might be related to crests. "Honestly, I don't know," Shay had replied, as Constance rolled her eyes at them both. "I'm sorry I can't tell you more. I'm sure you guys are good people, but this isn't the kind of thing I'd like to run my mouth about. I'm hoping you'll accept that I'm traveling to Morphais in search of answers just like you are." At that, Linhard had fallen absolutely silent, and Constance had raised her eyebrows, at which Shay had quickly realized what he had said. "And not that I've been spying on you," he'd exclaimed a little too loudly, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace as he chuckled nervously. "It's just, you know, it's a little hard not to overhear things down here." And they had been obliged to admit the truth in that statement. The two of them hadn't exactly been discreet about their aims, and after Constance's transformation, it would be more surprising if the stranger hadn't drawn any conclusions. "I'm not asking you to tell me about it if you don't want to," Shay had gone on to assure them. "And I swear I won't tell anyone about what I've learned." "Actually," Linhard had said then, and Constance had tried to glare him into silence, because she heard in his voice that he was about to be led by his curiosity to say something preposterous or even dangerous, but he had pretended not to notice. "You said you didn't know how you calmed Constance down so effectively, and I suppose I have to accept that. But the fact remains that you probably averted a catastrophe, and since we are still a bit unclear about how and when Constance's episodes are triggered, I was thinking maybe we could." Constance could already see where he was heading, and she waved her arms in front of him with widening eyes. "Linhard, think before you speak. We should discuss this in solitude." He'd turned to her then, shrugging as if to say, "What choice do we have?" "It makes sense, Constance," he'd said. "He said himself that he's a mercenary. People hire him for protection all the time. Right?" The last word cast in the other man's direction. Shay seemed to be mightily confused about the turn their conversation had taken, because he simply blinked at them for a moment before finally stammering out, Yeah, that's true. So how much do you want for a few weeks or so of protection? Linhard, Constance had tried again, somewhat less ardently this time, since she was beginning to realize that his plan might not be as reckless as she had first feared. He had shaken his head as he waited for Shay to stop being completely dumbfounded. If he can jump in and calm you down whenever you turn, we won't have to fear your episodes anymore. We can work more freely then. Doesn't that sound much better than risking our lives every time we go out into the sun or discuss a sensitive topic? She hadn't known what to reply to that. Of course, it would be better. But this strange man. Could he really be trusted? Eventually Shay had given them an estimate of what it would cost them, and after Constance had vehemently reminded him that he was already heading to Morpheus for his own reasons, so any price they paid should naturally be connected solely to the work he did as their guard and not to the journey itself, he'd reluctantly agreed to cut the salary in half. As an additional precaution, Constance had written up a makeshift contract to swear him to secrecy, if he were to listen in on their therapy sessions, and follow her as closely as the employment demanded. He could not be allowed to pass on anything he learned. He signed the contract without much hesitation, which granted her at least some reassurance. And so, strange though it may seem, they had decided to employ the mysterious stranger, the man with secret powers even he himself did not fully understand, as their protector for the foreseeable future. And now the three of them found themselves leaning in over a sailor's badly scribbled map of the entire continent of Morpheus, just barely avoiding knocking their heads together as they attempted to figure out how they would travel to the famed metropolis of magic. She had a distinct and uncomfortable feeling that she would come to regret their decision very soon. If Hubert had been concerned that traveling with Yuri would be bothersome, he was soon disillusioned of that concern. While he would perhaps not describe the other man's company as pleasant per se, neither was he particularly obnoxious or loud. In fact, from the moment that they woke up, as they made themselves ready in the mornings, and throughout their days of riding, Yuri hardly ever initiated conversation at most. He replied to Hubert's earliest attempts to make polite conversation with impassioned hums or short affirmative comments. While it was somewhat of a relief to not have to converse with the man who had hunted him down for the harm he had done to his own fiancée, the fact that did not know the extent of Yuri's motives irked him. Was he truly here simply because Constance had asked him to? Or did he have ulterior motives? So far, their journey had been free of any major incidents, no slitherers in sight, and no other complications as of yet. For the most part, they kept to smaller roads or took roundabout paths through the forests. They varied between pushing their horses to gallop and allowing them hours of slower-paced trots, and at the moment, they were in one of the latter phases. Crow padded along obediently behind them, sometimes leaving their side for half an hour or so before returning again, probably with his belly full of some prey or other. As long as Yuri stayed silent, Hubert would have little chance of revealing any potential ulterior motives. But seeing how none of them exactly enjoyed each other's company, any attempt to make conversation might spark suspicion. From the corner of his eye, he looked in Yuri's direction. The other man wore an almost bored expression, gaze moving casually from one side to the other as he took in his surroundings. He'd removed his collared cape and tied his hair to the side in a lazy ponytail, and was quietly humming a tune to himself while his fingers tapped out a matching rhythm against his thigh as the other hand held the reins. He looked for all the world like a relaxed traveler, but to a practiced eye, there were little hints of the real truth behind the facade. How his gaze never stopped moving to and fro, how the hand tapping out the rhythm never went far from his sword, and how, at just a discreet look from Hubert, he stopped humming and sighed. Stop gawking or pay up, Vestra. Appreciating this fine piece of art doesn't come for free. Hubert exhaled in dry amusement as he turned his gaze forward again. You are mistaken. If anything, I was appreciating your stance. What sounded like an earnestly surprised chuckle bubbled up and escaped Yuri's mouth. Wow, that's smooth. I'll have to remember that one. He glanced at Hubert, and when he continued, there was an almost teasing lilt in his voice. Maybe if you weren't such a despicable human being, I'd have even blushed. Despicable, Hubert repeated below his breath. If Yuri truly saw him as a despicable person, he would neither have let him live nor accepted Constance's feelings for him. It was clearly an exaggeration for dramatic effect. Still, he wondered what words the trickster would use to describe him if he was being completely earnest. "I guess some people find jerks like you exciting," Yuri muttered. "Such as Constance." The question had left his mouth before he could stop it. He pressed his lips together tightly. He should leave Constance out of this. She might have asked Yuri to go after him, but she was not to blame for the trickster's sharp tongue. "For now," Yuri acknowledged calmly. Hubert held in a scowl, keeping his face bland. He knew exactly what Yuri was attempting to do, because the two of them were more similar than he suspected even Yuri would like to admit, and he had hoped to do the exact same thing. It was irrational, selfish, and completely unnecessary, but yes, Hubert wanted to knock him down. Assert dominance like some simple brute. Was this what he'd heard described as lovesickness? An overpowering need to rid himself of this jealousy the other man sparked in him? Either way, if he could use this jealousy as an excuse to get Yuri talking, then he supposed at least one of his problems had a solution and possibly, if he played his cards right, both of them. "She was very disappointed that you did not come to the wedding," he said in a conversational tone. "I told her that it was likely you had simply been caught up in your work." This time, Yuri said nothing. Hubert didn't look in his direction, but if he had, he suspected he would have seen a perfectly calm expression on his face. "Of course, that is not what I truly believe happened," he continued. "Your recent actions speak of a different explanation for your absence. Pray tell, did you deliberately arrive late so that you wouldn't need to see her accept me as her husband?" "Think what you want," Yuri said. "My reasons are none of your business." Hubert exhaled softly, smiling despite himself. He knew very well that it was difficult to get a rise out of Yuri Leclerc, but he could not help but notice that his tone of voice had turned rather short. "My apologies. A sore spot, I understand." Again, the other man stayed silent, but when Hubert glanced at him now, he found his jaw tightly clenched. He decided to change tactics. Perhaps if he revealed that Constance was headed for Morpheus, he might learn something from his reaction. "At least you showed up eventually," he said. "You clearly met with Constance in the dungeons. Did you help her escape, as well?" There was a pause then. If Hubert had to wager a guess, Yuri's thought process went something a little like this. Did she actually escape, or is he simply telling me that to watch my reaction? Or, third alternative, is he asking because he doesn't know whether she is still in the dungeons or not, and he actually needs to know? In any case, what does he expect me to answer? If I say yes, he'll learn that she escaped. Does that benefit him somehow? If I say no, will he read it as a lie? If I act surprised, will he know it as a lie? If he knows that I met with her. But how does he know that I met with her in the dungeons? Is he gambling on the fact, or did he have someone tell me? I accidentally revealed to him that I knew he was going to Shambhala. If he hadn't told anyone but Constance about it, that would be a glaring giveaway. He had, in fact, not told anyone but Constance and a few well-chosen spies of his. And Yuri's weary question a few nights ago had been just the confirmation he'd needed that he had indeed met with her. "She escaped?" Yuri asked after several long seconds. The question was asked calmly, as though he was simply inquiring about which road they were to take next. Apparently he had come to the conclusion that feigning surprise would be most beneficial to him. Now what did that tell Hubert? Not much, unfortunately. Either Yuri had been instrumental in her escape, or he'd simply met with her, left, and didn't care much about whether she did escape or not. All that the exchange told him was that he had managed to catch Yuri at least somewhat off guard with his question, otherwise, he would have given a reply sooner. Yes, Hubert said. She's currently on her way to Morpheus. You don't seem too bothered by that fact. Hubert smiled slightly. Neither do you. Yuri hummed distractedly, clearly opting to stay silent as he focused ahead of them. As the silence grew longer, Hubert amused himself by once again imagining Yuri's thought process. It was a productive enough endeavor, and good practice at that. Why would he tell me that she is going to Morpheus? Why would he tell me that she escaped at all, when he clearly didn't ask because he was wondering about it himself? He does seem unbothered by it, but that could just as well be a facade. He's dropping hints for me, but for what? Is he really going to Shambhala, or somewhere else? If he's headed for Morpheus as well. This would be a long detour, completely unnecessary unless he has another destination in mind first. No, wherever he is going, it's clear that there is more going on here than meets the eye. I'll need to gather more information before I can draw any conclusions. If nothing else, seeing how long he could keep Yuri Leclerc in the dark was an entertaining little game, with the added benefit of successfully distracting himself from his jealousy. Once again, he glanced in the other man's direction, but with no intention whatsoever of being discreet about it. Yuri sighed again and muttered something below his breath, but this time, he didn't quip anything back. By the time the ship finally landed on the coast of Morpheus, Constance was so fed up with life on the sea and not to mention, being caged in with two of the most annoying people she had ever met in her life that she nearly ran straight out the door to jump off the ship the second she realized they had reached their destination. It was only thanks to Linhard, who remembered that the sun was blazing outside and promptly caught her wrist to stop her, that she narrowly avoided another unexpected transformation. In the end, they solved that little conundrum by covering her head with a coat and having Linhard guide her off the ship and into the shade of the overhang of a roof in the harbor. Meanwhile, Shay took a more discreet path, not wanting to rouse the suspicion of any of the sailors since he had never paid for the passage. They met up beneath the overhang, with Shay frowning at the other two as they discussed how best to find some place to spend the rest of the day before beginning their travel. "Why not go right away?" he asked, causing both of them to turn their gazes to him. "I don't see why we should lose precious daylight. I've heard it gets real cold in the desert at night." Constance scowled at this. "Precious daylight? Precious daylight? I'll have you know. You never told him, did you?" Linhard interrupted her, at which she fell silent. "Never told him. Ah. Indeed," she seemed to have missed that detail. Crossing her arms over her chest and looking away from them both, she tried to look unfazed as she spoke again. "Oh, I suppose not. Well, I happen to have a rather complicated relationship with the sun and would rather not travel until it sets." By that she means that if she goes out in the sun, she transforms like she did on the ship. "There is no need to be so rude about it," she exclaimed in a shrill voice, turning to Linhard with a glare. Shay looked between the two of them uncertainly, as though he couldn't decide whether they were telling the truth or if they were trying to play him. All right, but there wasn't exactly any sunlight streaming in when that happened." "It's complicated," Linhard said wearily, "and we can explain later. Right now, let's just find somewhere to stay until the sun sets." Just a few minutes' walk down along the coast, they found a seafood restaurant and bar filled to the brim with sailors waiting for their next journey, and although the sun was high on the sky, many of them were very clearly intoxicated already. Constance let her gaze move over the loud and rowdy men and women who were laughing, drinking and or playing some kind of card game against each other for money, doubting whether this was truly a good idea after all. Linhard seemed just as phased as her, having frozen in the door with both hands locked around the strap of his shoulder bag. "At least the food looks good," he said quietly. Apparently Shay wasn't quite so squeamish, because he stomped inside without hesitation and elbowed his way over to a table in the corner that only had one person seated by it, an older man with a long and rough beard, dressed in weather-worn clothing and holding a pint of beer in one scarred hand. He eyed Shay warily, but nodded shortly when asked whether they could seat themselves at his table. Shay waved them over, and the other two reluctantly made their way through the crowd of loud sailors to sit down opposite the man. "If you give me some gold, I'll order food and drinks for the three of us," Shay said. Relieved not to have to move through the bodies again, Constance quickly fished out a few coins and handed them to him. "I'll have some 2 fish sauté, if they offer it on the menu," she said. "Otherwise, please order the most inconspicuous dish you can discern. Oh, and if they have wine, that would be lovely." "Same for me," Linhard said. "Except I'd prefer water over wine." "Got it." And he disappeared into the mass of bodies, moving toward the bar. Squirming somewhat in her seat, Constance turned to face the stranger across from them. He was studying them both with a hard gaze, likely wondering what a pair of fine nobles from Fodlan were doing in a shoddy bar on the Morpheus coast in the middle of the day. Having come to the conclusion that it would probably be preferable if they did not get off on the wrong foot with someone in their first half hour on Morpheus ground, especially seeing that they might be spending the rest of the day by this very table. Constance smiled and made a shallow bow with her hand held over her heart. "How do you do?" she said in a pleasant tone of voice. "My name is Lady Constance, and this is Lord Linhard. We hail from the noble Adrestian Empire of Fodlan. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, Mr." His gaze took in her clothing, darted to Linhard's face, then returned to meet hers. "Mathios," he said in a voice that was just as rough and worn as his appearance. She nodded eagerly and clasped her hands together, glad that he seemed to understand their language. "Mr. Mathios. I am so pleased to meet you. Are you perchance a traveler, as we are?" There was a moment of silence where he simply glared at her, causing her to grow somewhat uncomfortable again. She was just about to clear her throat and excuse herself, perhaps going after Shay would be less trying after all, when he replied. "In a way," he said in a thick accent. "I bring travelers. I travel with travelers." "You travel with travelers," she repeated uncertainly, trying to interpret what he meant. "So then. Ah. Do you perhaps guide travelers to and from Morphais?" Mathios nodded. "Oh, that is perfect," she exclaimed, causing Mathios to narrow his eyes in suspicion. "We happen to need exactly such a guide. Tell me, how do you best make such a journey? Do you have horses here? I haven't seen any as of yet." "Calm down a little, will you?" Linhard muttered, sinking further into his seat with a sigh. "You're always in such a hurry. Can't we just eat and take it easy for a while?" She rolled her eyes. "You'll have to excuse my friend here, Mathios. He is hopelessly lazy." "Kamijla," Mathios said. "Better than horse." When Constance looked at him in incomprehension, he added, "Camel." "Ah," she said slowly. "Camel. I see." The prospect of riding a camel all the way to the city of Morphais was daunting to say the least, since she had only ever encountered the animal in drawings and stories of life in the deserts. But if that was the way of this land, and the most efficient way of travel, then she supposed she should have to accept it. Shay returned with plates of food, not exactly 2 fish sauté, but something that seemed rather similar. Apparently they did not have wine, but the bartender had suggested another alcoholic beverage that should be reminiscent of wine. Constance took one sip of the beverage and almost immediately spat it out. She coughed violently, desperate to get the foul taste out of her mouth and throat. "Ugh! How much alcohol is this?" Shay shrugged as he seated himself beside her. "I don't know. Is it really that strong?" She scooted the glass toward him and he drank of it. He swallowed the first taste quickly, coughed a little, then smiled. "Okay, yeah, it's a bit stronger than wine. But it's not that bad." Constance sighed, already feeling rather homesick. "In any case," she said, then gestured to Mathios. "This is Mathios. He guides travelers to and from Morphais. Is it not perfect? If we pay him enough, I am sure he shall agree to take us there tonight." At that, Mathios made a throaty sound that gave the impression of surprise, his eyes widening. "Tonight? No," he said firmly. "Night is cold, dark. Hides danger." Constance frowned. "Oh? Is that so? Then how about..." She looked surreptitiously to the sides, then reached into her pouch and laid out some coin on the table. 1,000 gold for your troubles." Mathios drew a large gulp from his own beverage, which Constance now suspected was not actually beer, then eyed the coin without much interest. "Changing gold to Hrima is a bother. But even if not, I will not travel in the night. No Morphe will. Not for much gold." Feeling somewhat deflated, Constance did as Linhard and sank more deeply into her chair. "That is just perfect. How are we supposed to reach Morphais without a competent guide?" "We still have the map," Shay supplied, nodding to Linhard, who pulled it out of his bag and laid it on the table together with a quill and inkwell. "Could you make this map a bit easier to follow?" he asked Mathios. The old Morphe leaned forward slightly to peer at the map. After a moment of deliberation, he took 3 coins from the table, then grabbed the quill. He dipped it in the inkwell and brought it to the map, muttering foreign words to himself as he crossed over some of the landmarks and drew in arrows pointing them to new places. along with completely new landmarks that apparently pointed out where they should turn in this or that direction. When he was finished, he dropped the quill to the table and leaned back again, taking another large gulp of his beverage. Once again, the three Fodlanders leaned in to study the map, heads only barely avoiding smashing into each other. After reassuring themselves that yes, this new and improved map did make much more sense, Constance made a grateful bow to Mathios. "We shall forever be in your debt, Mathios." He simply grunted in response, then shook his head and muttered some more fian to himself again. She had to assume that they were not kind words. After night fell, Shay and his newfound employers mounted a camel each and started making their way toward the city of Morphais. Constance seemed to have more than enough coin to spare for their travel expenses, which made him wonder whether she was from a noble family whose name he'd recognize. Both Linhard and Constance had made sure not to reveal their family names to him, which he supposed made sense. But no mere commoner would have that much gold on them, that's for sure. If he'd been a less honorable guy, he might have just taken her money and been done with it. But first of all, he was not that kind of guy, and second, he was still going to Morphais as well, so he could just as well tag along with these strange figures. Because they really were quite strange. Not only did Constance have some kind of condition related or unrelated to his own that made her transform temporarily into someone with other motives, she also couldn't be out in the sun due to that very condition. He'd never heard of someone like that before. Then again, he'd never heard of someone who had a mysterious being living in their head either, so he probably couldn't call himself the normal one. He rode just a short distance behind the other two, keeping an eye out for the so-called trouble that Mathios had warned them of. Constance and Linhard were talking with each other in low voices, but he could still hear what they were saying. "Hey," Linhard said. "I know we're technically not in a safe environment yet, but I just need to ask. What happened back there on the ship? When you transformed?" Constance shivered, though it was unclear whether she did so from being reminded of her transformation or from the coldness of the desert at night. Mathios really hadn't lied when he'd said that the nights were cold. Shay was wearing a thick jacket over his armor, and he was still freezing. The darkness probably didn't make things better, either. Linhard had conjured a light orb for them, but it only lit up maybe 10 feet in each direction. "I remembered something," she replied quietly. "Something from my childhood." "Did it have anything to do with the Dada and Brigid war?" Constance was silent for a while. Shay tried to remember what that war had been about. As far as he could recall, Dada and Brigid forces had tried to overpower the Adrestian Empire but eventually been pushed back. Brigid had been made a vassal of the Empire after that. That's about as much as he knew about it. He'd been too young to fight in that war, so he'd only heard about it from afar. "Yes," she said eventually. "Or rather, the days before." Linhard hummed as he took this in. "You were saying something about how you didn't mean it, and it was never supposed to, something. Do you remember?" She nodded, then shivered again. "So does that mean?" "We should not talk about this now," she said, her voice unsteady. "As you said, we are not in a secure environment." Linhard didn't seem to like this, but he agreed with a solemn nod. "Right. Your new friends certainly are something," Arvel muttered, a bodiless voice in his mind. "What do you think they are hoping to find in Morphais?" "I don't know," Shay murmured, slowing his camel somewhat so he'd gain a little more distance to the others. "What are we hoping to find?" "I told you," Arvel said with a sigh, "I do not know for certain. All I know is that something about that name is familiar to me, somehow." "Do you recognize the language?" "The one Mathios spoke?" "No," Arvel said. "Not at all." Shay shook his head. "This seems like a long shot, Arvel." "Morphais is supposed to be the metropolis of magic," the voice dryly reminded him. "And your powers are clearly magical. Even if my faint memory turns out to have failed me, there is still a good chance that we might find some clues in Morphais." Yeah, he muttered. "I swear, you just want to." He cut himself off as something bright and projectile-like pierced the ground in front of his camel. The animal drew to an abrupt halt, stumbling to the side with a fearful, throaty grunt. Shay jumped off before it could throw him off, drawing his sword as soon as his feet met with the ground. "We're being attacked," he called to the others. He wouldn't have had to. 3 more similar projectiles hit the ground again, 2 in front of Constance and Linhard's camels, 1 right next to Shay's own 2 feet. Constance shrieked as she fell off her camel, only narrowly avoiding being trampled by its heavy hooves when Linhard, who had managed to slide off his animal somewhat more smoothly, cast a quick light barrier around her. As their camels continued panicking, Shay ran up to his employers, covering them with his sword as he tried to see their attackers in the thick darkness around him. Linhard widened the shield to fit all 3 of them, veiling them in a thin barrier of pure glittering light. Panting softly, Shay moved his gaze from side to side, prepared to strike as soon as the attackers came near. "What are you waiting for?" he shouted. "Show me what you've got." "What are you doing?" hissed Arvel. "There are at least 3 of them, and only 1 of you. You cannot trust these 2 friends of yours to be of much help in a fight." Just then, 2 shapes appeared from the darkness, then 1 more, then 2 more. 5 in total. All of them wore battle armor and had hands glowing with magic. "Oh, just great," Arvel groaned. "Is this going to be one of those times where I have to keep you right on the precipice between life and death again?" "You're wrong, Arvel," Shay said with a grin. "I'm not just 1 against 5. There are 2 of us." Extending his free arm to the side, he called forth his second sword, chuckling when he heard Constance gasp behind him as it materialized in his hand in a flurry of bright sparks. "Let me show you exactly what you've invested your money in," he said. Then he pushed off with his heel and ran straight toward his attackers, out of the protective shield and into the kind of unfair fight that he lived for. "Ow!" Constance jumped at the sudden sound from her left, coming face to face with a scowling Linhard. "You're digging your fingernails into my arm," he complained. "Oh," she breathed, immediately releasing him and taking a step to the right, while making certain to stay within the bounds of his shield. "I apologize." She steered her gaze toward the fight nearby, where their newly recruited bodyguard was single-handedly slaughtering 5 expert mages with his double swords, one of which was glowing in the telltale dark violet shade that meant elder magic was involved. "So it's true," she thought, eyes wide as he drove that very sword straight into the chest of one of his combatants. "I was right to doubt him, he is an elder mage. But what kind of strange elder mage fought with a sword? Not to mention, a sword that had seemingly been conjured from out of nowhere? And on whose side was he? Surely if he was one of Thal's grunts, he would have taken better care to hide his powers from her. Surely he must understand that she would not be able to trust him now that she knew the truth. He pulled the sword out of the dead attacker's chest, ducking as what seemed like glowing hot sand shot past right above his head. That was another odd part about all of this. What kind of magic were the attackers using? As of yet, she had not seen a single magic circle either in front of their hands or below their feet, and she recognized none of their spells. Some of them used the strange sand magic, while others seemed to be casting magic made out of the darkness around them itself. Not elder magic, but something incorporeal. Completely soundless magic without formulas, it seemed like. Was that even possible? The man who called himself Shay expertly navigated between the spells, seeming to even warp between his targets instantaneously at times, and as one of the more agile mages readied what seemed to be the most powerful spells yet, something happened which she would never in a million years have been able to guess. Shay let out a loud warcry as he extended his sword arms down and to his sides, and in the next second, bright sparks of magic enveloped him from top to toe. When they scattered again a mere moment later, he had changed shape. Not in the complete shape-shifting way that Thales or Lysias had done, he still retained his overall figure and looks. But now, orange-red glowing, things hovered both like large bracelets around his wrists and like a collar behind his neck, and as she glimpsed his face, she saw bright V-shaped marks on his cheeks and glowing golden eyes. "Linhard," she gasped, grasping for his arm again. "Yes," he whispered, seeming completely stunned next to her. "I see it too." Just before he had transformed, he had spoken to himself again, just as she had heard him do several times before on the ship. He had called himself Arvel. Who in the world had they really employed as their bodyguard? When the last mage dropped dead not even a minute later, Shay stood panting over his prey for another moment before his shoulders relaxed. Glittering sparks enveloped him again, turning him into his regular old self, and then the additional sword disappeared from his hand. He stumbled to his knees, leaning forward to spit into the sand as he continued panting. Constance and Linhard remained frozen within their magical shield. Judging by the shivering inhalation she could hear from her companion, she suspected they were thinking along the same lines. If he decides to turn on us, we will be dead in seconds. As Shay or Arvel, or whatever his true name was, got to his feet and started making his way back to them, Constance held her breath. Her free hand automatically went to the bracelet on her other wrist. If only she'd had her magic, or if Hubert had taught her how to fight with daggers. She was utterly defenseless like this. Linhard, she whispered unsteadily. Are you able to? Not a chance, he breathed. Did you even see any of that? Shay stepped into their little space inside the protective shield, grinning even as he panted. So, he said in a voice filled with the rush of adrenaline. Are you guys glad you hired me or what? As night fell and the two of them closed in on a town in the northeastern parts of Aegir territory, they were confident enough that no one had been tailing them that they decided to spend the night in an actual inn. After they got off their horses and as Hubert paid the innkeeper for 2 rooms, Yuri stayed a few steps behind, thinking. He leaned against a wooden beam in a corner of the room, his arms crossed over his chest as he watched Hubert slide over just the right amount of coin across the bar. They'd told Crow to stay outside while they went in, just in case the innkeeper wouldn't appreciate housing a large wolf in one of his rooms. They could smuggle him into one of the rooms later. The one whom the wolf picked would no doubt be smug about it for the rest of the evening. Yuri had already prepared himself for defeat in this regard. The dumb wolf was clearly as enchanted by Hubert as Constance was. The first day or so, Yuri had been convinced they weren't actually headed for Shamhala. But they'd kept riding in the same direction, and unless Hubert's true destination was somewhere in Leicester or somewhere else in the Hrym mountains other than Shamhala, there weren't really any other options than the good old underground city. It was just that no matter how he looked at it, Yuri couldn't for the life of him figure out why Hubert would make such a ridiculously misguided decision. He had to agree with Constance. The odds of them finding anything worthwhile that could help remove the curse were extremely low compared to the odds of them simply walking into a death trap. But that couldn't be it. Hubert von Vestra, the minister of the imperial household, the tactician of both the Black Eagle strike force and Her Majesty's army, the man whose schemes were rivaled only by those of Yuri himself and the former leader of the Leicester Alliance, could not simply be walking into a death trap with no ace up his sleeve. That was a complete and utter impossibility. There had to be something else Yuri wasn't seeing. He just didn't have enough information yet to make a good enough guess, and it was starting to drive him mad. After Hubert had received their keys and they had made their way outside to Crow again to move their horses to a stable in the back, something happened which finally made Yuri's patience snap. A white dove fluttered down from the roof and landed on the saddle of Hubert's horse, and as Hubert reached out toward it, Yuri noticed the little roll of parchment tied to the dove's leg. Narrowing his eyes, he watched as he removed the note and unrolled it. It took him little more than a few seconds to read it, and as soon as he was finished, he conjured a flame in his palm and burned it to a crisp. Before Yuri had even made a conscious decision, he had Hubert pressed up against the outer wall of the stable, right forearm pushing up against his chest as he stared him down. The fingers on his left hand flexed around the grip of one of his knives inside his jacket. Hubert coolly met his gaze as Crow stood to attention next to them, growling uncertainly. "Listen, Vestra," Yuri said smoothly, keeping his voice low. They were alone back behind the inn, but he had no intention of drawing anyone's attention from the streets. "The only reason I'm here is because I owe your fiancé a favor. If you're going to insist on keeping me in the dark, I might just decide that the debt has been paid and leave you to fend for yourself. So if you want that ace up your sleeve, you better start talking." Hubert exhaled what sounded like an amused breath, one corner of his mouth quirking up in the faint flicker from the nearby lantern. "What do you wish to know?" He might have been surprised by his sudden willingness to cooperate if he hadn't been so irked by that pesky smirk of his. Just barely keeping a snarl out of his voice, he said, "First things first. Even you aren't stupid enough to walk into an obvious trap, but you're clearly headed for Shamhala. Mind telling me why that is?" "I've had spies keep an eye on the areas surrounding the collapsed city," Hubert replied calmly. "In the first weeks after its destruction, everything was quiet. However, there have been strange occurrences in the area more recently, occurrences which suggest that those who slither in the dark have a vested interest in something beneath the rubble. Yuri straightened, tilting his head to the side as he studied the other man's face closely. Was he telling the truth, or was this just a feint to distract him from asking about his true destination? He still doubted that he was telling the full truth, but what he'd said didn't sound like a complete lie either. You believe they're after something valuable, Yuri wagered. At the hint of a new smile on Hubert's lips, he continued, so why not leave it to your spies? Leaving in Bear now after everything that's happened lately seems like bad timing. I still believe there may be resources on Elder Magic there that could aid in freeing Constance from the curse. If there are other secrets hidden below the ground, I will unravel those as well. Yuri narrowed his eyes. Hubert had spoken the words with his usual dry lilt, and he looked completely calm as he met his gaze, but there was still something there that set off alarm bells. Maybe it was nothing, maybe it was only that his instincts went haywire in the vicinity of the infamous liar of the imperial household, but he had the distinct feeling that Hubert was trying to conceal something in plain sight, like he was concealing the truth with carefully told lies that seemed perfectly logical and natural under the circumstances. If it had been anyone else, he might not have bothered to dig any deeper. But he had heard enough about Hubert von Vestra, had seen enough to trust his own instincts when they told him that something fishy was going on. Still, the man clearly wasn't going to tell him the true reason why he was risking it all to go to Shamhala, and if the rumors were true, he never acted without a plan C and D along with plans A and B. Heck, he probably even had a plan Q. Hubert von Vestra was simultaneously the last person he would trust in all of Fodlan and the one person he might trust the most when it came to strange plots, especially when said plots were connected to Constance. Yuri nodded tightly. That'll do for now. I trust that you're giving me enough information to be able to watch your back, at least. So now to the obvious next question. He glanced toward the dove, which was still sitting on the saddle, as though waiting to be excused. What the hell did that note say, and where was it from? This time, Hubert looked noticeably more reluctant. Without breaking their eye contact, he pursed his lips slightly as he clearly considered his options. I will not share what it said, he said, then just as Yuri was about to argue, he added, but we shall need to make a minor detour tomorrow before we continue to Shamhala. The note was from someone I tasked with tailing Constance, and while I believe that she is safe for now, there have been some concerning developments in the recent days. I would like to take some additional precautions to ascertain her continued safety. Yuri stared at the other man, brain working overtime as he tried to wrap his head around what he'd just been told. If Hubert had someone tailing Constance, that was basically proof that he had expected her to escape, which meant that it was part of his overarching plan, somehow, and Yuri needed to figure out how. But apart from that, what the hell had that note said to make him suddenly start worrying about her, when he'd seemed completely fine with both her escape from the dungeons and her travel to Morpheus up until this point? A detour to where? He asked, because it was the first question he thought of that seemed safe to ask. Hubert's expression soured, as though the question had made him think back to something that made him particularly annoyed. When he answered, he did so in a voice dripping with displeasure. To see an old friend who happens to live nearby. Chapter 12, Grains of Sand. Exhaling deeply in a weary sigh, Yuri leaned back against the wall and lifted his gaze. As one hand distractedly twirled a knife between its fingers, he absently took in the extravagant golden details of the white walls and the lofty ceiling decorated with intricate carvings and paintings. He'd seen many mansions just like this, and it always made him marvel over the stupid things nobles wasted their money and time on. Imagine how many mouths could be fed with just a fraction of that amount of money. Instead, more and more money was shoved into the bottomless pit that was the upkeep of these enormous mansions. Movement beside him drew his attention, and he lowered his gaze to see Hubert von Vestra cross his arms over his chest as he too heaved a sigh. His own gaze slowly drifted across the hallway, a habit Yuri could relate to more than well enough, and more out of boredom than any actual interest in picking a fight. Yuri decided to break the silence. You must feel right at home here, he said, reveling in the faint scowl that appeared on Hubert's face. This place set Hubert uncharacteristically on edge, and it hadn't exactly been difficult to figure out why. It's almost as gaudy as the palace. He fully expected to get a shut up well, in Hubert terms, but the response he got instead actually managed to surprise him. Clearly this is much worse. Yuri raised his eyebrows, allowing a small smile to show on his lips as he regarded the other man, whose gaze had now also found the horrible ceiling. Interesting. He'd actually found something he and Hubert could agree on apart from Constance. Funny that it should be an opinion about yet another person. He was about to reply, but stopped himself when he heard footsteps approaching from down the hall around the corner. They were light but decisive steps, coming in quick succession as their owner hurried through the hallway. He and Hubert exchanged a look of mutual understanding in the brief moment before a figure rounded the corner. The tall man, proudly dressed in riding clothes and with his long red mane tied into a loose bun on the back of his head, came to a prompt halt the moment he saw Hubert. Then he extended his arms in greeting, grinning as he let out a pleased "Ah! Hubert von Vestra. I never suspected I'd see your face again so soon, although it is as always a pleasant sight." He turned to face Yuri, a small frown forming between his eyebrows as he slowly lowered his arms and made an uncertain shallow bow. "And Yuri Leclerc, was it? My apologies, I do not believe I've had the pleasure of a formal introduction. My name is Ferdinand von Aegir," Yuri said wearily. "Yeah. I know you." Ferdinand's expression went from surprised to pleased in a matter of seconds, which Yuri found simultaneously amusing and annoying. "If you had any idea what kind of deeds your old man employed me for over the years, you wouldn't be so eager to invite me in." "Oh, of course. Well, at any rate, I welcome you to my proud estate. You both must be absolutely worn out from your journey. I'll have some tea prepared, and we can all enjoy some pleasant conversation in the gardens." "We won't be staying long," Hubert said. "We are rather pressed for time, I'm afraid." Ferdinand's grin faded, expression slowly growing grim. He took a quick step closer to Hubert, leaning in toward him, at which Hubert's eyebrows rose slightly in dismay. "Ah," he said in a low voice. "I didn't wish to intrude, but I had a suspicion after what occurred at the wedding." "Indeed," Hubert said, loudly enough to cut the other man off. "Perhaps we may have a word in private." Ferdinand gave a resolute nod. "Of course. Come with me." He gestured for them to follow him, and then he took off with his confident stride back down the hallway. As they fell into step behind him, Yuri sidled up close enough to Hubert that he could murmur, "I thought you two were supposed to be the twin jewels of—" "Do not finish that sentence," Hubert warned in an urgent whisper, shooting him a death glare. Then, when Yuri just smirked in response, he sighed and added in a slightly calmer voice, "He is not always a thorn in my side. However, the man is entirely incapable of tact. And you can't stand to be reminded of what you did to Constance," Yuri finished silently. "Duly noted." As always with nobles, private seemed to have an entirely different meaning compared to what Yuri and, if he had to guess, Hubert as well would prefer. Ferdinand led them into a large, open room that seemed to have been built for giants, holding a long and wide table, enormous windows facing into the luscious gardens, paintings that covered every single window-free space on the walls, and a grand chandelier hanging from the high ceiling with glittering jewels that were larger than Yuri's forearms. He counted to 6 other people in the room except for the 3 of them, with 2 seemingly being servants and the other 4 standing guard along the walls. A glance in Hubert's direction told him that he wasn't the only one who wondered at Ferdinand's interpretation of the word private. "Please," the noble exclaimed as he strode up to the table and gestured widely to the high-backed chairs. "Seat yourselves as you please." He spun to face one of the servants. "Bring out the finest china and prepare the Aegir blend, if you please." "Yes, my lord," the servant replied with a deep bow. "Right away, my lord." As he quickly but professionally strode out of the room, Ferdinand turned back to his guests with a proud smile. "Now, Hubert," he said, "you cannot possibly come visit without finally tasting my very own brand of tea. Do you remember when I told you of it, in the Gareg Mock courtyard? Your variant of the southern fruit blend," Hubert said as he walked up to a chair, gently placing a gloved hand on its back. "How could I forget?" Ferdinand's smile widened into a grin. "You are more attentive than people credit you for." Yuri rolled his eyes. Whatever they were here for, he was not in the mood for charades. While the other 2 seated themselves by one end of the table, he padded up to the windows and leaned back against a window pane as he gazed out across the Aegir gardens. It was one of the larger ones he'd seen in his life, its lush greenery rivaled only by that of the palace gardens in Inver. He distantly wondered if Constance had grown up playing in gardens like these, with perfectly groomed labyrinths and tall fountains glittering with rainbow light reflected by the sun. She'd once told him that she knew Ferdinand from a young age. So maybe she'd spent a good amount of time in these very gardens, too. He tried to imagine a young, energetic blonde in a noble girl's dress running through the labyrinth outside, laughing as she looked over her shoulder to see how far behind Ferdinand had fallen, her eyes gleaming with joy in the sunlight. He didn't realize that he'd been smiling to himself until he felt his expression grow solemn. Now, Ferdinand's voice said behind him, calling him back to reality. "What can I do for you, old friend?" Yes, this was something Yuri had puzzled over as well. Ferdinand had a noteworthy position in this part of Fodlan, sure, but how would he be able to ascertain Constance's continued safety, as Hubert had put it? For all they knew, she had reached Morpheus already. Not even Edelgard's influence could reach her now. "One of your trade routes runs between Boromaz and Morpheus," Hubert said. "Correct." "Why yes, that is correct. We import exotic goods such as spices, herbs, and fabrics from Morpheus. In fact, one of the spices in the Aegir blend originates from the metropolis of magic itself." "Perfect. We are in need of passage on one of your ships to Morpheus sometime next week. Can that be arranged?" Yuri held himself still, keeping his gaze on the gardens outside. The fingers on his left hand absently drummed against his right biceps as he took in this new piece of information. So that was how he planned to help Constance. By going after her to Morpheus. But if he intended to leave for Morpheus next week, that meant he was still headed for Shamhala before that. Morpheus? That is an intriguing destination, Ferdinand said after a brief moment of stunned silence. As far as I recall, the next ship is not meant to set sail for Morpheus until the end of the month. Will you be able to make the necessary arrangements? Hubert pressed. Why? Yes, of course, it should be of little issue to reschedule the departure. I assume you wouldn't ask unless it was important enough to warrant such an adjustment. But, Hubert, the sound of clothes rustling slightly, followed by Ferdinand lowering his voice, clued Yuri into the fact that the man was likely leaning in toward Hubert. Is this about Constance? I must confess, I too had the thought that her sudden shift in personality might have to do with some kind of dark magic, but do you truly believe? With all due respect, Hubert said sharply, effectively cutting Ferdinand off. The details of her condition, as well as the purpose behind my need of passage to Morpheus, are highly classified pieces of intelligence. Both I and Lady Edelgard are grateful for your aid, anything beyond that is above your need to know. There was another moment of silence. Yuri cast a furtive look over his shoulder to see Ferdinand sit back in his chair with a conflicted expression on his face, hands locked and resting on the table's surface, while Hubert sat beside him by the edge of the table, waiting calmly while Ferdinand decided what to do next. Seeing the nobleman so clearly troubled by the whole situation was unexpected. He could only ever remember having seen him in the past with a stupidly proud and happy expression on his face, so watching him in some kind of turmoil over Constance's well-being made Yuri pause. Maybe Ferdinand von Aegir wasn't just a simple nobleman like the rest of them. He might actually be the only person remaining in Constance's life who had seen her smile and laugh in the sun, and who worried that the path she had headed down in the years since held nothing but dark and horrible pain. Or maybe Yuri was just projecting his own feelings onto Ferdinand, simply because he was the literal antithesis to Hubert. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important about all of this. Please, just, Ferdinand trailed off, then got something resolute in his expression. He shook his head and clenched his hands into fists on the table. If this is about Constance, he said, holding Hubert's gaze firmly as he spoke, promise me that whatever the reason behind her actions during the wedding, you will not give up on her. Well, this was an interesting turn of events. Yuri's gaze shifted to Hubert. The way he saw it, Hubert had two options: brush Ferdinand off like he had done just a moment before, or force himself to face the reality of Constance's situation and the fact that he had been instrumental in causing her so much pain. Hubert looked at Ferdinand for a long moment, seeming to mull it over just as Yuri did, before finally giving a cautious nod. That was never my intention. And maybe Yuri just imagined it, but when they left the Aegir residence a short while later, there seemed to be something different about Hubert, There was an absent look in his eyes and a pensive wrinkle between his brows, almost as if he was struggling to come to terms with his feelings about what Ferdinand had said, if Hubert von Vestra even had feelings. But as soon as he noticed Yuri studying him, he immediately righted his expression into calm blandness, and the moment was gone. As they'd continued their journey to Morpheus, Constance and Linhard had agreed vehemently on one thing: they needed to keep Shay as their hired guard. For now. After the bandit attack in the darkness that first night, the two of them had purposely fallen behind the mercenary as they rode onward, hoping to exchange a few words in solitude. It was clear that they were in full agreement regarding the risks with continuing their travels with the man who called himself Shay, but if possible, it was even clearer that they had no other realistic options. They were somewhere in the middle of the desert, with little to no magic with which to defend themselves, and Shay had proven himself highly capable of protecting both himself and the two of them from any potential dangers lurking around them. They had seen him cut through 5 mages, 5 bandits who had taken them by surprise as though they had been butter. They had seen him come out of the whole spectacle without so much as a scratch. They had seen him grin, his eyes gleaming with adrenaline, as he came back to boast of his victory. Whoever Shay was, and whatever his aims were, there was no doubting that he was a very capable combatant, and that for now, they desperately needed him. And as the days passed and they neared Morpheus, and they traveled for long hours together with the mysterious stranger with powers suspiciously similar to the ones of those who slither in the dark, they slowly and jointly became more and more convinced that Shay needed them as well. For one, he was completely incapable of following directions. They had quickly realized that showing him the map that Mathios had corrected for them was entirely fruitless, since the most useful thing he had so far done in response had been to look around, point at the very obvious waypoint nearby that Mathios had indicated on the map, and exclaim, "There! I think that's it." Second, it was clear that if Shay purposely hid his knowledge of elder magic or curses from them, he was doing it so flawlessly and unquestionably that it was beginning to seem much more likely that he in all actuality had less knowledge than even Linhard did. At one point during the first of their longer rests along the way, Constance had tried to test him in order to see if she could make him unknowingly reveal something to her. She had done so surreptitiously, dropping small and harmless little hints to see if he would bite, but so far, the most intriguing result that had earned her had been when she'd casually mentioned creststones in the context of shapeshifting, and he had started to shake his head before pausing to frown at himself, then shrugged and changed subject. Apart from that, he hadn't even seemed to notice that she was testing him. She had formed a theory that perhaps Shay had a creststone in his chest just as Hubert did. That might explain his powers, including the ability to teleport easily between targets. But as of yet, there had been no suitable excuse for why she would need to lay her head against his chest and listen for a heartbeat. If indeed he was hiding something as such from her, he would catch on immediately if she attempted such a trick without being cautious about it. Still, it was the obvious next step in her research. In the meantime, she and Linhard had at least grown to relax a tad bit more around him, since he was clearly more capable in combat than in the intellectual arts, so to speak. It was unlikely that Shay intended to trick them or turn against them, and so far, he had seemed to retain control over himself even when he changed into his alternate shape. By the time that they arrived in the city of Morpheus, they had yet to decide whether they should separate themselves from him or not. However, that concern practically evaporated from their mind the moment that they first set foot within the city walls. The metropolis of magic wasted no time in proving that it deserved its namesake. As the 3 Fodlanders walked through the gates, they were welcomed by sights of mages all around them. Atop sand-colored houses, children made great joyful leaps between the rooftops with gusts of wind at their feet. Near food stalls in the market, merchants lit fires beneath their kettles and cauldrons merely by using simple hand gestures and murmuring words of magic to themselves. As they passed a mother and her child, the young boy leaned down next to a stray dog and conjured water into a bowl for the animal to drink. Constance watched in gleeful awe, marveling over the fact that even in Morpheus, they were apparently using black magic until Linhard pointed out what she had yet to notice. "Do you see any magic circles?" he asked quietly. She frowned, not grasping his meaning at first. Then she inhaled sharply as she whipped her head up to look at the children playing on the rooftops again. They jumped easily back and forth, practically dancing on the wind, but even when she stopped and concentrated to look closely, she could discern neither magic circle nor any telltale glow around the children's hands. They were simply walking out from the rooftop, or jumping bravely into the air, and as they did so, the wind caught them on its own and brought them to where they needed to be. And when she lowered her gaze to watch one of the merchants who had lit a fire just now, she noticed as they came closer that the woman did not in fact seem to be murmuring a spell, but instead speaking in an almost soothing tone to the fire beneath her cauldron. "What in the world?" she breathed. It was just as with the bandits that had attacked them. She had convinced herself that she must simply have missed it, been too gripped by fear to notice the regular signs of magic use, but now that she had the time to stop and study people around her using magic in bright daylight, although, of course, in clouded weather, it was quite apparent that her mind was not simply playing tricks on her. How? How should I know? Linhard asked, his own gaze roaming the sights before them in fascination. Some kind of innate magic, perhaps. Constance widened her eyes, gripping Linhard's arm in excitement as they walked past a woman who, as she ran a hand through her long, newly washed hair, seemed to pluck the moistness out with her fingers and wrench the drops out into a bowl beside her. A few seconds later, her hair was completely dry. If Constance had spoken the Morphean language, she wouldn't have been able to keep herself from bombarding the woman with questions. For now, however, all she could do was dig her fingertips into Linhard's arm and hope that they would soon run into someone who might be able to interpret for them. Linhard covered her hand with his, grimacing. "You need to stop doing that, Constance." "Oh," she breathed, pulling her hand away and holding it against her chest instead, without moving her gaze from the woman with the long, dry hair. "My apologies." "So," Shay said a few paces behind them, seeming completely oblivious to the awe-striking mages around him. "Where do you think we'll find the library?" "Ah, yes. The library." Constance forced herself to tear her gaze away from the woman and face forward, down the main street. There were so many stalls and such a busy crowd around them that she could hardly see 5 feet ahead, but they had all agreed that finding the great library of Morpheus should be their first task as soon as they reached the city, if nothing else, so that they could find an interpreter who knew Fodlanes. If there was such a person here somewhere, their best estimation was that they would find them in the library. That was, after all, where a person from Morpheus would have found Linhard or Constance if they came to visit Fodlan. According to Mothio's map, Linhard said, the main street should lead us there. Which makes sense. Cities are usually built around a central library, where all of the citizens' collective knowledge is kept. "If only I had my magic," Constance said with a sigh. "I could have dispersed this crowd in seconds." She gave Linhard a furtive look. "Perhaps you could." "I don't think we want to draw attention to ourselves," he cautioned, giving her a meaningful look. "Not yet, anyway." Constance looked around at the people in the stalls and the crowd on the bustling street. Many of them immediately looked away when she met their gazes, but she saw enough of their stares to know that they had already drawn attention to themselves. As she lowered her gaze again, she made a mental note to procure Morphean clothing later, clothing which seemed to consist mostly of long, colorful shawls and fabrics wrapped around the body and fastened with braided belts of varying lengths. Even the Morphi who carried weapons at their waists wore the same kind of shawls, although they had them wrapped more tightly around themselves and complemented the flowing fabrics with practical trousers and jackets. She briefly wondered what Hubert would look like dressed in Morphean clothing. His fondness for long, dramatic capes and tall collars likely lent itself well to the long shawls, although she suspected he would have preferred ones in dark colors. They wandered for a bit longer, until the crowd around them eventually thinned out, and the street began to slope upward. There, high above the rooftops of the sandy Morphean houses, towered a great and ancient building that drew her thoughts to a palace, with its domed ceilings and majestic spires reaching toward the clouds. She glanced at Linhard as they began to climb the steep street, and saw his eyes gleam with excitement. While both of them ultimately had the library as their destination on this journey, she knew that Linhard could barely contain himself at the thought of finding new resources on Crests from the perspective of a foreign people. Whatever mysteries this library contained, she was certain that Linhard could lose himself in them for a good long while. As could she, of course, but she was on the hunt for something different entirely. She was on the hunt for something specific. Although, she thought to herself as they neared the great gates of the library, perhaps it wouldn't hurt to take a little joy in the rest of the library's resources in between her avid search for a way to rid herself of Lysia's curse. Libraries are an amazing invention, don't you think? Linhard said dreamily when they stepped through the gates and found that there was no barrier to entry whatsoever, even for foreigners. All of our ancestors' knowledge, preserved and contained within miles of shelves for the free perusal of anyone in search of enlightenment. Ah, yes, Constance agreed wholeheartedly. For once, we are in full agreement. Shay said with a shrug, yawning as he stretched his arms up above his head while they walked into the middle of the entrance hall and looked around. I guess. Never really thought about it that way. So, where to first? Constance spun around, taking in the dozens and dozens of bookshelves that she could see in her immediate vicinity, interspersed with small tables for 1 to 4 people and ancient spiraling stairs leading to other floors. There were signs on the edges of some of the bookcases, but they were all in Morphean. First, Linhard said as he walked up to point at one of those very signs, we find out if they have a foreign section with books in Fodlanes. Unless you learned enough from Mathios to be able to interpret for us. With a thoughtful hum, Shay looked around for a moment before confidently striding up to a row of shelves where a Morphean woman in red and violet garments currently stood sorting in returned books to their rightful spaces. Constance and Linhard exchanged a look, but followed quietly behind to see what he would do. Excuse me, Shay said, causing the woman to yelp and jump in the air before spinning around to take in his unfamiliar clothing with wide eyes. Do you speak Fodlanes? She blinked up at him, stammered something in Morphean and shook her head. Then, without looking away from Shay's face, she raised an arm to point at a man standing by a desk nearby, a man who, at the sound of what might just be his name Timos leisurely turned around to face them. When he saw their motley group of foreigners, his eyebrows shot up toward his hairline, and he distractedly put away the book he had been holding into a shelf right next to the desk. Dressed in a swath of dark blue fabrics that wrapped flatteringly around his figure, with long, flowing hair in the color of Morphean sand, and a nose and mouth so symmetrical that they almost seemed to have been sculpted by human hands, he was quite the striking man, and when he slowly began to smile as he caught Constance's gaze, that image only strengthened. Ah. Let me guess, he said in a heavily accented Fodlane similar yet somehow more musical than that of Mathios as he gracefully strode up to meet them. Visitors from Fodlan. He extended an upturned hand to Constance, which she automatically took as she blinked up at him in a daze. His smile widened slightly as he leaned in to place a chaste kiss on the back of her hand, bowing deeply as he did. When he released her again and turned to greet Linhard and Shay, it was all she could do to bring her hands to her chest and try to collect her wits in the face of such an unexpectedly charming man's presence. It did not help that he had narrow eyes that reminded her greatly of Hubert. My name is Androtimos, he said, bowing once again, before shifting his weight onto one leg and placing a hand leisurely at his hip. How did you know where we come from? Linhard asked, at which Androtimos laughed a beautiful, melodical laugh. I apologize, he said. Your fashion is very distinct. That, and you looked just as lost and awestruck as Divishiagia Lysithea when she first arrived. Linhard perked up beside Constance just as she covered her mouth with a gasp. Did you say Lysithea? It was the most excited she had heard Linhard since he told her of the magic behind the marvelous little things that Hubert had locked around her wrists. But surely it couldn't be that Lysithea? The Lysithea who had joined the Empire in the war, and then promptly disappeared soon after their victory in the kingdom? Androdimos' smile wavered somewhat. His gaze fluttered quickly to the side before returning its focus to Linhard. Ah. You are not here for her then, I take it. After they had successfully convinced Androtimos that while they were not there for Lysithea per se, neither did they wish her any harm whatsoever, he agreed, still clearly slightly uncomfortable about the situation, to lead them to where he had last seen Lysithea in the library that day. For a moment, Constance almost expected him to lead them to an empty seat, shrug, and say something about how she must have left already, but then as they climbed a fourth set of stairs, her gaze caught onto a head of hair so brightly blonde that it could really only belong to one of 4 people, of which only one was likely to be the culprit this time. If it weren't for that very hair, Constance might have mistaken her for another Morphe woman, seeing that she was wearing the same kind of colorful fabrics wrapped around her body as the other people they had seen so far. Her color of choice was apparently dark violet. So sorry to disturb you, Divishiagia, Androtimos called when they had reached the top of the stairs, causing the blonde woman to turn her head and look in their direction. Might these people be familiar to you? As Lysithea's gaze landed on Constance and Linhard, her eyes grew so wide that they nearly overtook her entire face. Linhard? Constance. In the very flesh, Constance said automatically, too dazed by the sight of Lysithea to say much else. The other woman practically leaped out of her chair before hurrying over to their little group, until she froze in place a few paces away, staring suspiciously as Shehu waved awkwardly in greeting. "Hey," he said. "I'm, their hired muscle." Lysithea's gaze snapped to Linhard, who nodded impatiently. "Never mind him. What are you doing here?" She eyed Shay skeptically a second time, before shaking her head with a sigh, her shoulders dropping nearly an entire inch. "What do you think?" she asked in her characteristically sharp tone of voice. "Naturally, I'm looking for a way to remove crests. My time is running out, and I refuse to spend my last grains of sand simply waiting for the inevitable." "Have you found anything?" Linhard asked, clearly trying and failing to contain his excitement over this little tidbit. Lysithea pursed her lips as she crossed her arms over her chest. "Do you really think that I would still be here if I had?" "Sorry to disturb you again," Androtimos said beside them, smiling slightly as they turned their gazes toward him. "I will take my leave. You know where to find me if you have need of me, yes?" "Yes." "Thank you, Timos," Lysithea said, nodding in confirmation. "My pleasure, Divishiagia." Constance looked after Androtimos as he, after wishing them farewell with another bow, left to gracefully walk down the stairs. Judging by what Lysithea had called him, they seemed relatively close. "Do you know him well?" Linhard asked quietly, sounding strangely annoyed as he too looked after the other man. "His Fodlanes is flawless." "He's a well-read man," Lysithea said with a dismissive handwave. "He was excited to meet someone from Fodlan when I first arrived in Morphise, because he's studied our culture and language since he was a child. But forget about him." Constance turned back to face her just as she walked over to the table where she had been sitting until just now, dozens of books spread out over its surface. The selection of Fodlane's books in this library is comparatively small, but still too extensive for me to get through by myself quickly enough. Now that you're here, we might finally get somewhere. She paused just as she reached the table, casting a wary look over her shoulder. "Why are you here, again?" After exchanging a look and asking Shay to make his rounds around the floor they were on, Constance and Linhard dove into a compressed explanation of what they were hoping to find in Morphise for Linhard. This included any potential resources on crests, and for Constance, she naturally mostly hoped to find a cure for her curse. After Constance had explained the nature of that curse, Lysithea thought for a moment before digging through her pile of books after something in particular. "I know I read something about, Here." She victoriously held up an ancient tome with worn edges before them, showing a Morphean title, before gently laying it on the table and starting to browse through its fragile pages. Hopeful that Lysithea might actually have found something useful to her endeavor with the curse, Constance leaned in beside her and watched her browse in silence. It soon became clear that Lysithea had yet to fully learn the language, seeing that there were notes with partial translations tucked between certain pages here and there. She must have received some help from Androtimos with the translations. Finally, she reached what she had been searching for. She took out a note from the pages she now had open and gave it to Constance. "Could this be what you need?" As Constance's gaze excitedly fluttered across the note's surface, taking in the details of an ancient Morphean spell, Linhard also leaned in over her shoulder to read its contents. It proved quite intriguing at first, especially in regard to the fact that the spell prescribed the use of blood in its casting, instantly reminding her of elder magic. However, when she reached the end of the note, her hope had already drained away again. "I'm afraid not," she said, trying not to sound too dejected as she returned the note to Lysithea. "This is a spell to separate two entities housed within the same body. As far as I can discern, Dark Constance is not in fact a separate entity from me, but simply a cursed version of me, the curse being able to latch onto me fully whenever I lose my courage." Lysithea received the note with a solemn nod. "I'm sorry. It's all I can remember finding so far that might be of aid to you. However, I have been here a month and have barely scratched the surface yet, especially regarding the tens of thousands of books that are in Morphean. Maybe Timos might be able to help you? He's a capable librarian." Constance sighed. Very well. I had not expected to find an answer so soon at any rate. She turned to gaze out of a window as Linhard walked up to look through the other books on the table. It seemed the clouds had thickened after they entered the library, with the wind coming on strongly now. There were gusts of sand blowing across the nearby rooftops. Gusts of sand, blowing in the wind. There is another thing, she exclaimed, turning back to the other two mages. She waited until they had their attention focused on her rather than the books. Do you perhaps have an inkling as to what kind of magic is wielded here in Morpheus? We saw neither magic circles nor magical sparks around the mages we glimpsed on our way here. Oh, Lysithea said, shoulders slouching somewhat as she once again lowered her gaze to the books. Yes, they have their own kind of magic here. I attempted it myself, but apparently I was not modest enough. She rolled her eyes. I do not have enough time to waste, but if you wish to try it for yourself, I suggest finding the Primalist. The Primalist? Linhard asked, a note of intrigue in his voice. Yes, I suppose you could call her a kind of archmage, Lysithea continued distractedly as she seated herself by the table and began to browse through another book. She was willing to meet with me, so I'm sure you two can get an audience as well. Ask Timos, he knows the directions, and could probably interpret for you if you need it. Constance caught Linhard's gaze. She read his thoughts clearly on his face and could only agree. If there was a woman in Morpheus who would share with them the secrets of an entirely new system of magic, then they simply could not refuse the chance to meet with her. The library and its potential treasures could wait. Whatever magic the Morphe wielded, she needed to unravel its mysteries. Chapter 13, The Gamble. Just as Lysithea had suspected, Androtimos was thrilled to guide them to the so-called Primalist, or as he called her, Protareikos. He was even more excited when they asked if he would be willing to interpret for them. My Faudlanes has improved much since Lysithea arrived, he explained happily while he led them through Morpheus, nimbly navigating through busy crowds and narrow side streets. Most notably, in speech. I have read many books in your language, but rarely have the chance to speak it myself. The few Faudlanes visitors we get are often more interested in other aspects of Morpheus than its library. You don't say, Shay muttered a few paces behind them, causing Constance to roll her eyes. While he had said nothing explicitly, it had been clear as day in his expression as he returned from his rounds in the library that he much preferred the kind of action that the ambush in the desert had presented to them over dusty books in a language he couldn't fathom. Perhaps he regretted agreeing to accompany them as their bodyguard, although if he did, he had enough courtesy at least not to bother them about it. They were paying him, after all, and handsomely, at that. Of course, Divitiagia Lysithea has also developed her Morphean quickly, Androtimos continued with a smile. Perhaps if she was as smitten with my language as I am with yours, she would be fluent by now. Morphean is unlike anything I've heard before, Linhard said as they turned a corner into a larger street with less of a crowd than the one with the market. Is that so? Androtimos asked. Morphean builds upon a language that was originally spoken in Faudlan a long time ago. He paused, then leaned in toward them and added in a slightly lower voice, although, you should not bring it up with any Morphe you meet. There are many among us who consider it a sensitive subject. Constance glanced at Linhard, noticing the tiny little wrinkle between his eyebrows as he very clearly struggled not to ask for more details. If there was one thing Constance had learned after working so close to Linhard in the palace, it was that one should never mention to him that something was forbidden knowledge or secret in any way. Linhard could simply not resist secrets, especially not when it came to his own special interests. She must confess that she was intrigued as well this time. She tried to remember if she had ever heard any language in Faudlan like the one spoken by the Morphe, but could draw nothing to mind. Perhaps it was a language that had died out, or that was spoken by so few people that she was not even aware of its existence. Here we are. The house they stopped by looked no different to the ones around it, apart from a flat wooden sign above the door which was inked with Morphean letters and supposedly spelled out Protareikos. It was a narrow building, but it extended 4 floors up into the air, its rough, sandy surface interrupted only by 2 open windows on each floor apart from the ground floor. Faint music, soft, relaxing tones accompanied by light bells flowed their way from the rooftop. Androtimos strode up to the door, which was decorated with a solid brass door knocker in the shape of Constance almost did not believe her eyes at first, the shape of the sun. He gripped it and knocked it against the door, and moments later, a sudden but soft gust of wind gently fluttered his long hair against his back, followed by the door slowly swinging open. He smiled at them over his shoulder. "She has heard our call. Come, I suspect she is on the roof." As Constance and Linhard started after him, Shay leaned back against the outer wall next to the door and crossed his arms over his chest. "I'll keep watch," he declared, gaze already roaming the area in search of something to distract himself with. Constance sighed, but agreed. She doubted that they would need him in the next couple of moments at any rate, and she knew him well enough already to understand that he would simply be bored out of his mind if they asked him to come along, and she suspected that neither she nor Linhard wished to bring an impatient child with them to the Primalist. The two of them silently followed Androtimos into the narrow building, taking in what was at least to their foreign eyes some very odd and unexpected choice of furnishing. As Androtimos led them directly to a set of stairs in the back of the house, Constance marveled over the sheer amount of greenery around them. For being a house in the middle of a desert city, the Primalist certainly had managed to get her hands on quite a lot of living plants, and not just the spiky cacti they had seen along their travels, but large, leafy plants and flowers with vivid colors. The floor along almost every wall was lined with earth that housed large and thriving plants of all kinds in all possible colors. Many of them climbed the walls themselves, swirling up toward the ceiling, and by the staircase, vines wrapped around the thin metal railing. Encased in some of the walls were what Constance suspected must be some kind of watering mechanisms, although they also seemed to double as modest little fountains. They were shaped in the fashion of elephant heads, with water dribbling down from the elephant's trunk and into its mouth. She had to confess, the sound of the water was calming, and although the sight might have made her raise her eyebrows anywhere else in the desert city, the fountain's existence made complete sense surrounded by all the green life around them. Even among the sparse furniture, soft-looking pillows, a few lanterns hanging from the ceiling, and low tables holding trays of candles ran little canals of murmuring water through the floor, most of them covered with glass, but some completely open to the air. There were windows on the back wall of the house, and as the three of them passed by, a soft breeze caressed their skin on its way up to the next floor, gently playing with an ornate wooden wind chime along the way. The next couple of floors were filled with more greenery, water, and even more fresh air passing through the open windows on both sides of the house, and Constance soon found herself gawking with wide eyes at the sheer amount of life around them. The entire inside of the house almost seemed to be breathing, watching, sensing them walk through it, and even though she had no magic to draw from, she could almost sense the buzz of black magic potential in every corner. She looked at Linhard, but he seemed to be more curious than amazed, reaching out to graze his hands against some of the leaves and the elephants' heads as they walked past. Of course, his specialty was faith magic, not black magic. He would not be as in tune with the nature around them as Constance felt. After the fourth staircase, they emerged from relative darkness and out onto a bright rooftop, and although the sun was still veiled by clouds, there was no shortage of warmth or light around them. Even the rooftop was filled with greenery, and while there were no little canals running along the floor here, the furthermost part of the rooftop was dedicated to a beautiful little pond with slopes and caves which were built entirely from smooth, dark stones and gave the water its very own playground to bumble around in. Along one wall, beneath a canopy covered with climbing vines and amid a pile of soft pillows in bright colors, sat a cross-legged man with a strange contraption in his lap. It looked like a chaotic arrangement of brass pipes in various shapes and sizes. Some of them were straight, while others looped around each other like tangled ropes, and along the outermost edge of one of these pipes sat a row of little bells in rising sizes. The man was slowly but surely moving his hands in smooth, swirling gestures around the instrument, seemingly using magic to force wind through the pipes and the row of bells, and it created the loveliest tune of somber yet relaxing music that Constance could ever remember hearing. Near the pond stood an elderly woman dressed in light and airy fabrics in all the colors of the rainbow, her forehead decorated with four thin, parallel lines in blue, red, white, and green that seemed to have been drawn onto her skin. Her eyelids were painted in silver, her eyes lined with black, and her silvery gray hair was loosely braided and hung forward over one shoulder. Her harshly wrinkled face wore a kind and serene expression as she turned to face the newcomers on the roof. She gestured toward the city with an arm that wore many bracelets that made a soft tingling sound as they swayed against each other. "Privoxenos Anavitos," she said, A phrase which Constance had learned was meant to signify a greeting in Morphean. The three of them repeated the greeting, Androtimos with the same perfect accent as the woman, and then Androtimos continued with a string of Morphean that included Lindhardt's and Constance's names. The woman listened, nodding as she gauged the two Fodlanders with her dark and wise eyes. Then Androtimos turned to the two of them. "This is our Protareikos, Eleni, or, translated directly, Ray of Sunday." Constance held in a wince at the translation. She supposed it was a beautiful name, seen from the Morphe people's perspective, since the sun was usually very intense here in the desert. She distantly wondered whether Androtimos had translated her and Lindhardt's names into Morphean as well, and if so, which words he had used. "Eleni does not comfortably speak Fodlanes," Androtimos continued, pausing to give the elderly woman a reverent smile. "However, I'll be glad to translate between you. She sometimes receives visitors from Fodlan. Lysithea was another example, and I'm usually called upon to translate. Her son here," he pointed to the man with the strange instrument, "knows some Fodlanes, but I try to assist whenever I am available." He bowed shallowly. "Feel free to speak, and I shall translate." Constance glanced at Androtimos, taking in his kind smile, before fully facing Eleni, who waited silently with a smile of her own and her hands locked in front of her. Uncertain just how to address the primalist, Constance gave a deep bow, glaring at Lindhardt until he did the same. When she straightened again, she tried to mimic Eleni's smile. "It is a veritable pleasure to meet you," she began, glancing at Androtimos once again as he smoothly translated her words into Morphean while she spoke. "A friend of ours told us of your prowess. We have traveled far from Fodlan to unravel the mysteries of your magic." This was only half a lie. While the mysteries of their magic might not have been their main aim with the journey, it was certainly a large part of her original wish to travel there. "And are already quite amazed by the feats we have seen proof of during our first passage through the desert and then the city streets of Morphais." The woman kept smiling as she responded in Morphean, and Androtimos immediately switched to Fodlanes. "It is not uncommon that visitors from Fodlan come here to learn our magic. Although the craft is best learned from a young age, there have been examples of successful Fodlanes wielders. You wish me to teach you the fundamentals, yes?" Constance's eyes grew wide. Oh, that would go beyond my wildest dreams." However, she sheepishly lifted one arm in front of her to show one of the bracelets Hubert had locked onto her wrists. "I'm afraid I currently am unable to cast much magic at all. These contraptions siphon all magical energy out of me and release it into the surroundings." Eleni lowered her gaze to the bracelet, smile fading slightly as she frowned at the simple metal shape. For a moment, she simply looked confused, then, to Constance's great surprise, she scoffed and muttered something in Morphean that for some reason Androtimos did not choose to translate. When Constance cast him a look, he shook his head, but before he could explain, Eleni spoke out in a louder voice again, and he began to interpret for them. "I see why that would be an issue in your country," he said, listening closely to Eleni as she spoke with clear scorn in her voice, "where you bend and shape the magic to your will. Here in Morphais, we do not wish to control the magic, rather, we heed its will and guide it where it wishes to go." Constance and Lindhardt exchanged a look. He looked as confused as she felt. "I'm afraid I do not quite grasp your meaning," she said, turning to look between Eleni and Androtimos. The latter intervened with his own words this time. "Us Morphe use magic rather differently from Fodlanders," he explained. "While you exert your own powers to control the magic that lives naturally around you, we are more in tune with the natural intentions of that magic, and simply help it blossom in new ways." Here, something uncertain came over him, and for a moment, he almost seemed to be in discomfort as he continued, "I believe you've crafted rigid systems and formulas around magic in Fodlan." "Correct." Constance opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. She stared at Androtimos at his insecure expression, as though the mere thought of such rigid systems was entirely inhumane to him, and tried to come up with an answer that would paint them and their magic in a less harsh light, but her mind was blank. They did not use formulas? They, what, listened to the magic? Lindhardt was speechless beside her as well, although perhaps he was simply listening with curiosity. While he was also a keen magic user, he was perhaps not so emotionally invested in his magic use as she was. This new piece of information. The fact that there apparently existed ways to utilize the natural wishes and wants of the magic itself. It was so foreign to her that she nearly expected to wake up from a dream at any moment. Before she could come up with a response, Eleni spoke again, and Androtimos was quick to interpret. Magic does not come from humans, it comes from nature. As she continued, she gestured at the various influences of nature around them, at the sun in the sky, the water in the pond, the air around them. We cast fire by adhering to the sun's wish to warm and brighten, we gather water by helping the tiny little drops of moisture all around us to reunite with their peers, we walk in the air by channeling the playfulness and weightlessness of the wind. So, similar to black magic, then. Constance tried, having found her words again. As soon as Androtimos had translated that for Eleni, she scowled and responded with a word so clear and sharp that there was no need for him to interpret it at all. It was a clear no. Faudlane's magic is a greedy attempt by humans to wrangle control over nature against its will. Morphean magic, on the other hand, is primal, not augmented like the magic of Faudlane. Constance was so stumped by this hateful description of the art form she had spent her entire life practicing and mastering that she once again found no words to say in response. However, it seemed to have the opposite effect on Linhard. "How does one go about casting Morphean magic?" he asked. Constance turned her head to gape at him, taking in his calm expression. How could he possibly be so put together after what Eleni had just said? The primalist did not speak, she simply gestured toward the pond in a clear invitation. Linhard walked up to the water and sat down without hesitation, crossing his legs beneath him as he looked into the clear pond. After a brief moment of deliberation, Constance followed. If it was true that Morphean magic did not require power from her inner magical reserves in any way in order to function, then perhaps the bracelets might not be the complete and utter blockage she had assumed them to be. Perhaps she might actually be able to cast magic again, while still wearing them. "Listen to the water," Androtimos translated as Eleni spoke again. "Truly listen. What does it want? What does it like? How does it feel about its surroundings?" Constance stared at the water that rippled gently in the wind. What it felt? How could she possibly hear that? Beside her, Linhard slowly leaned forward and gently grazed the water's surface with the tips of his fingers. He let out a thoughtful hum, but did not elaborate on his thought process. Meanwhile, Constance took a deep breath and tried her best to empathize with the water. Keeping her gaze fixed on the wet material, she tried to imagine what it might feel like to be a liquid sloshing against black stones, reflecting the image of the sky on her own body. Perhaps it would feel freeing? Light? On the other hand, water could hold a great and deceiving weight, and the further down beneath the surface one came, the darker and colder it would become. She scowled at the pond. So far, nothing had changed in the water's form, not that she knew what could happen if she successfully empathized with a liquid. What does it want? Androtimos repeated softly above them, perhaps in an attempt to be helpful, but it only distracted her. She only just kept herself from snarling at him. What the water wanted. Eleni had said that they could gather water by asking water drops to unite. But what if one started with water, and wished to make it do something else? What then? She exhaled a frustrated huff of breath, glancing at Linhard to see if he was more successful. However, he was frowning at the pond, seeming confused as to why it would not behave the way he wished it to even when he once again grazed it with his fingers. In an attempt to try something new, Constance also reached forward to touch the water. It was warmer than she had expected, but just as wet. She thought back to the considerably larger pond in Garagmok and how she had managed to paint the reflections of the Novelli Gardens onto its surface, right before the eyes of an amazed Hubert. Hubert. She withdrew her hand to her lap again as she sighed in frustration once more. What might Hubert be doing in this moment? Had he reached Shamhala yet, if that was truly where he was heading? Was he even safe, wherever he was? A heavy sigh from beside her pulled her out of her distracted thoughts, and she turned to see Linhard get to his feet. "This is completely unnecessary," he muttered. "Why would I need to obey what nature wants, when I already possess the ability to tell it what to do?" "Excuse me," Constance exclaimed as she scrambled to get to her feet as well. She grabbed Linhard's arm, forcing him to face her, then gave him a harsh glare. Perhaps it is that simple for you, but you are not the one with these wretched contraptions on your wrists. Contraptions which you designed, may I remind you? Oh, please. He looked down at her wrists in distaste. I may have designed them, but it was Hubert who told me to do so. Hubert who thought it would be appropriate to take away your powers. Or maybe he didn't even worry about whether it was appropriate or not. Maybe he just saw a way to solve a problem. Either way, it has nothing to do with me. Constance gasped, tugging her hand back into her chest in shock. You pledge your innocence? To me, your victim. How dare you? Please, Androtimos said, more sharply than they had heard him speak thus far. Both of their heads snapped in his direction, only to see him and Eleni gaze back at them with dismay. Calm yourselves. You calm yourself. Constance cried, then spun back to face the water. She extended a firm hand toward its surface. And you? You will obey my will. You will learn to appreciate my innate power. That is enough. A hand gripped her wrist and tugged it away from the pond's direction, and Constance looked up to glare at Androtimos, feeling like a frustrated child whose parent did not grasp that she had rights. But while Androtimos' soft smile was gone, he did not look angry or scowled at her. He simply held her gaze with his, keeping her full attention on him. Remember what Lysithea said, he said in a low voice. One needs to be modest in order to commune with nature, not wrench its will against it. She gritted her teeth as she stared up at him, but she could not make herself yell at him, not when he was giving her that look. I understand that this is new and strange to you, he continued, his grip around her wrist loosening somewhat when he realized that she did not intend to talk back. Morphe children learn from a very young age to listen to nature, so to us it comes naturally. But this is something Fodlanders are not used to. Many foreigners have arrived in Morphes to study our magic, but become frustrated with the process and given up. It takes a certain kind of person, he said slowly, to learn the magic somewhat quickly even as an adult. Most will spend years without result. Constance huffed, but relaxed her shoulders. She was not used to struggling with magic. It had always come so easily, so naturally, to her. Androtimos may not know this about her, but she would show him. She would show him, and Eleni, and Linhard, and anyone who dared doubt her, that she was exactly the kind of person who could learn Morphean magic quickly even as an adult. She just needed to find the time and peace to work on it, and the magic would bend its will to hers. The only way to make Constance modest is if you place her in bright sunlight, Linhard said dryly. She spun her head to growl at him, at which he raised his eyebrows but did not reply. Clearly he was as annoyed with the Morphean magic as she was, and needed someone to take it out on. Androtimos released her wrist, then switched to translating Eleni again. If you wish to practice, there is an inn on the main street which prides itself on its interior garden. It is nearly as lively as mine. Perhaps, if you mean to stay in Morphes, that would be a suitable place to rent a room. Constance raised her chin as she steered her steps toward the stairs. Yes, she said decisively. That is exactly where we shall go. They reached the area near Shamhala under the cover of darkness, and left their horses some distance away before traveling the last mile by foot. Hubert could sense that Yuri was more on edge than usual beside him. There was none of the usual mockery, and at the slightest unexpected sound, a dagger quickly appeared in his hand. It was understandable, since he knew little of what to expect from their visit to the crumbled underground city. Hubert had given him only enough information that he would be able to properly respond to any threats they encountered. Most importantly, he'd informed him that there was a number of Vestris spies hidden around the area, and that Hubert had sent a scout ahead of them to share intel with those very spies. He'd also made it clear to Yuri that if they happened to encounter Lysias, he was to be caught alive at any and all cost. At the last warning, there had been a noticeable glimmer in Yuri's eyes, a sign that he found this piece of information intriguing. Hubert had weighed every single little piece of intel on a silver scale as he considered what to share with Yuri, and the fact that Lysias needed to be captured alive had been the one thing he had been most hesitant to reveal, because he knew that it would give Yuri an important hint as to his intentions. However, it was simply too vital to his plan that this detail remained unchanged, and so he had found no other alternative than to inform Yuri. If Lysias died, this would all be for naught. The area near Shamhala was deathly silent. Where before one had needed to enter through one of the secret, magically veiled entrances to reach the depths of the city, Constance's attack had exposed its existence to the outside world. In the past month, much work had been done to clear away the worst of the rubble, and a full week had passed before they could even enter the city itself. After that, apart from continuing to clear the way through the city, a large effort had been dedicated to the gruesome business of taking care of the thousands of deceased Agarthans that had met their end when the city collapsed. Hubert had received regular reports on the progress in the past month once. He'd even traveled to Shamhala himself to oversee the work, but he'd taken care not to share anything he had learned with Constance. After seeing her break down and cry as a result of what had occurred in Shamhala, he had determined that the number of dead bodies that had been found and taken care of in the depths of the city afterward was knowledge that she would be better off unaware of for the time being. Fortunately, she had never asked him about it, and so there had been no need for him to lie. He suspected that she would rather leave it all behind in the past and try not think of the consequences of her actions, however necessary they had been at the time. However, thanks to the amount of work that had been done since Shamhala collapsed, Hubert, Yuri and Crow could easily enter the city through a path that had been cleared in one of the southernmost corners of the upper area. In order not to raise too much suspicion, Hubert had made certain that there would be guards posted on key locations both outside and within the city, but he had also ensured that they would know to flee if any of the Agarthan commanders appeared. As such, 2 Adrestian guards greeted them with a nod each as they slipped through what was now the main entrance into the city, a large hole in the ground, with makeshift steps built from parts of the crumbled buildings nearby. They entered Shamhala silently, lighting the way with fire and light magic within their palms as they walked down the excavated corridors. The main power source of Shamhala had been destroyed, and so the veins in the walls and buildings were no longer buzzing with eerie blue-green energy. Magical lanterns had been hung up in strategic locations along the way, but an additional light source was still preferable. The main streets and plaza of the city were entirely inaccessible, but most of the narrower streets had been left largely intact, with the larger pieces of rubble being held up by what remained from the buildings around them. Now, that rubble above was held in place by magical barriers that had to be refreshed every day in order to stay up. The surface of the barriers glittered discreetly as the 2 men passed by underneath. As he had told Yuri beforehand, their main priority was finding resources on curses. The plan was for Yuri to head to the intact parts of the city's library, while Hubert continued further down toward the area where he knew Thales had kept his own chambers. He'd told his men to prioritize clearing these areas, knowing that this would be where they would have the highest chance of finding useful resources on all kinds of matters connected to those who slither in the dark. He had no idea whether they had managed to successfully clear a path to Thales' chambers yet, but if not, hopefully they had at least come close enough that he could clear the rest tonight. And so, when they reached the library, Yuri wordlessly veered off into that area, causing Crow to whine quietly and pause before deciding to continue down the corridor alongside Hubert. Despite himself, Hubert couldn't help smirking somewhat at this stupid reaction, but nevertheless, it granted him some satisfaction to know that the wolf would choose him over his old master. Never mind that it was likely due to the tracing spell Constance had cast on the animal. Even with his soft solace and light steps, his footsteps almost seemed to echo along the walls around him as he strode toward his goal. He resisted the impulse to look over his shoulder a handful of times while he walked. Ordinarily, he was not prone to nervousness or superstition, but Shamhala had always had a discomforting effect on him, and even more so after it had very nearly become his grave. The uncanny sensation was only heightened by the knowledge that he might currently be walking into a death trap with little control over his own fate. Lady Edelgard had been understandably hesitant when he explained his plan to her. Truth be told, if he had been in her position, he would likely have prohibited him from going through with it at all. It carried too many risks and brought along too much uncertainty, and if he failed or misstepped somewhere along the way, it could put the whole future of the Empire at great risk. And still, despite all of this, she had given him the go-ahead. She had hardly even questioned him, so much faith did she hold for his judgment and capabilities. And for this reason, for Lady Edelgard's faith in him, and for Constance's life and future, he needed to perform at the very top of his game this time. He'd gambled, and now he needed to win. As he neared his destination, he began casting various elder hexes, murmuring Agarthan words below his breath as he made sweeping gestures with his arm to guide the magic in the space around him. The hexes fixed themselves to the walls like large, glittering blankets that softly and slowly faded out of visibility to the naked eye. If someone came down this corridor now, he would know. He slowed his steps as he came to the end of the corridor, inspecting the blockage that met him. This was a pathway located beneath the rest of the city, and so there were no surrounding buildings to hold up the rubble that had fallen as a consequence of the pillars of light striking the city. On the positive side, there was not nearly as much destruction down here, because the streets above had taken the brunt of the hit, and this corridor seemed to have been reinforced. Still, it seemed a particularly heavy weight had landed on this part of the corridor, because the ceiling had caved in and made way for massive blocks of stone from above. Unfortunately, this was the only path he was aware of that led to Thales's chambers, and while he could not know for certain that he would find anything worthwhile at his destination, he could remember the large floor-to-ceiling bookcases and the desk with the locked drawers he'd seen on the one occasion that he had been in Thales's office, and the rubble in his way now was not enough of an obstruction to discourage him from trying to get through. The information held within those bookcases was bound to be of interest to the Empire, at the very least, even if it proved not to shine any light on the subject of curses. As Crow sat down beside him to scratch himself behind his ear with a back paw, Hubert got to work. First, he cast a barrier on the ceiling to stop any more rubble from collapsing into the corridor. Second, he sent a tendril of dark smoke toward the rubble, pushing the tendril through any little spaces he could find between the stones, until he finally sensed the space beyond. According to his estimation, the obstruction was around 10 feet in depth. Armed with this knowledge, and urged by the discomfort of being in Shamhala's depths, Hubert began using his magic to clear away the blocks of stone. He figured that the best and quickest method would be to smash the stone into fine gravel, which, considering the rate of energy consumption of such a spell, and how quickly he could regain the lost energy again, should take him about an hour. If he'd had Linhard with him, he might have been able to calculate a more precise estimate, but an hour seemed like a reasonable amount of time, at least. In the end, it took him 2.5 hours to clear the way. It had become apparent after about an hour of work that he had underestimated the depth of the blockage, and when he was finally finished, he had to take a few minutes to sit and rest with his back against the wall. He wished he could close his eyes for a while, but even with all of the hexes around him, he was too distraught by his surroundings to trust that he wouldn't be ambushed while he rested. So he kept his gaze on Crow, who walked up to lie down next to him and lay his large wolf head on his lap. Absently, he began to scratch the animal behind his ears, which rewarded him with a soft sigh in response. At least, Yuri had an entire library to entertain him in the meantime. He'd seen no sign of the other man, so he had to assume that he was still searching for resources on curses and that he'd found a section with books in Fodlanes rather than Agarthan. Hubert allowed himself no more than 5 minutes to regain some energy. It was unfortunate that he had been more drained than he'd expected, but now that the way was clear to Thales's chambers, the clock was ticking. With Crow on his heel, he strode forward, refreshing some of his warding hexes while he walked. He ran into no more obstructions, and after just a minute or so, he found himself standing in front of the great archway that had once been lit by the same blue-green veins as the rest of the city, but which was now completely dark and hollow. The door to Thales's office was open, and as Hubert stepped into the great room beneath the ground, he found that many of the books from the tall bookcases had been haphazardly spread on the floor. Whether a result of the force of the impact from the pillars of light, or a last desperate effort of Thales or his underlings to save the most important resources before everything collapsed, was unclear. Hubert stepped carefully over some of the books, waving a hand to lift them magically into the air and collect them in piles on the nearby desk. Lifting his gaze, he allowed himself a moment to take in the grandiose, ancient decor of the office, the myriad of unpowered vanes that ran across the walls and ceiling, the large but bulky chandelier that hung above the desk in the middle of the room, and the grand windows in the back of the room which had once magically reflected images of the forest outside the 3 hidden entrances to Shamhala. Now, however, everything was dark. Casting a basic fire spell to light a candelabra that stood near the desk, he walked over to the desk and leaned down in front of its locked drawers, running a hand over one of the keyholes. He doubted that Thales would have simple, ordinary locks on his drawers. He had to reluctantly admit to himself that it might have been good to bring Yuri here, his light magic should be able to easily identify any hidden hexes on the desk. But now that he was finally here, he did not dare leave his position to fetch Yuri, and he might end up destroying whatever was kept inside if he tried to force the drawers open without knowing what protected them. So instead, he got to his feet again and walked over to the bookcases. They were, at least, much better sorted than the Shadow Library in Abyss. The shelves were even marked with little signs in Agarthan. Hubert could translate most of them easily. There was one shelf for warfare, one for philosophy, another for languages. He paused by the next sign, which read technology. Before moving on to check what other categories there were, he took a moment to browse this shelf, pausing with his hand by a book with an Agarthan title that approximately translated into A Race Against Oblivion. Not quite certain what exactly it was that drew his attention to that particular work. Perhaps it was the fact that its title was clearly written by hand rather than printed, or the unexpected title that did not quite fit in with the surrounding books. He pulled it out and browsed through its frail pages. It turned out that the entire book was written by hand, an old, almost completely faded script in Agarthan which he had to strain himself to be able to discern. After a moment of looking through the index and browsing through some of the first pages, Hubert came to the conclusion that it was a record of how those who slither in the dark had managed to invent the technology that enabled them to successfully implant creststones imbued with elder magic into the chests of their people, and even transfer someone's consciousness into the body of a human host. A sound near the doorway caused him to look over his shoulder, already tensing up, but it was simply Crow stretching out on the floor. With a sigh, he turned back to the book. He shouldn't spend too long on any one resource. The more he could find, the better. Still, he could not keep himself from reading just a little bit further. Even though his Agarthan was far from perfect, he could at least understand the gist of the book's contents. Apparently, the book had been written by someone who had been present in the time of the War of Heroes, and who had seen the birth of the Agarthan technology with his own eyes. The author claimed that he had identified a highly competent mage, someone whom others saw as a heathen, and recruited him to a team of scientists researching various methods of warfare which could stand up to the powers of the goddess and her people. This mage had discovered how to forge the remains of, what he had to assume translated best into, beasts into powerful weapons, and eventually even invented a first, unstable variant of the Elder Ritual. The mage had been so crucial to the war efforts of the Agarthans in the War of Heroes that he had soon been promoted to commander, on the same level as the author himself. As the author put it, "For this technology was what ultimately saved the children of men, what enabled us to achieve victory in the race against oblivion." Hubert lowered the book with a slight frown, reflecting on what he'd read. This technology, which built on the remains of beasts. Could it possibly be referring to? There was a sharp growl from Crow, followed by a whine as the large animal quickly rolled to the side on the floor. Reacting instinctively, Hubert teleported himself down behind the desk, only to see a dark projectile strike where he had just stood, singing one corner of the cover of the book, which he'd accidentally dropped on the floor nearby. He heard another whine from Crow, then the sound of a thud, as though the wolf's heavy body had collapsed on the floor. Hubert gritted his teeth, readying a paralyzing spell. If this was Lysias. "Do you truly believe that you can hide from me, Vestra?" He tensed. This was a woman's voice, and one he recognized well from the time that he had cooperated with those who slither in the dark. Bias. Her footsteps came closer to the desk before stopping on the other side. "To think that you would return here," said Bias' voice, followed by a dry laugh. "Couldn't resist the temptation, could you? Well, let me be clear. This is a restricted area, and the punishment for trespassing is death." He could sense her channeling a new spell, and took the opportunity to teleport behind her, only to just barely dodge a hit when she spun around to fire her spell in his new direction. Bias was an incredibly capable Grimoire, more lethal than Lysias, second only to Thales, and in his current condition, still somewhat drained after clearing the rubble in the corridor earlier, he was already on the back foot against her. But he could not allow himself to flee. Because if he left the office, he was 100% certain that Bias would rather set fire to the entire place rather than give him a chance to reveal the deepest, darkest secrets of their organization. So rather than head for the door, as perhaps Bias had expected, he called on his elder magic and pulled up a veil of violet smoke as a shield in front of him, then fired a paralyzing spell in her direction. She easily evaded it by redirecting it toward one of the bookcases, where it fizzled in a shelf. She closed a fist, causing his shield to crack. "You shouldn't have come here," she growled. "Neither should you." The new voice came as enough of a surprise to them both that Bias wavered in her next attack, and before she could regain herself, a force of bright white light slammed into her from the side and threw her into the bookcases, making books rain down from the shelves above and fall down over her. As she pushed herself to her feet, glittering magic quickly wrapped around her and warped her away to the other side of the room, causing her to stumble straight into the wall. But when a dagger was launched in her direction, she threw out a hand to expertly redirect it toward Hubert, who ducked and rolled to the side. The dagger was caught in the air before it could pierce any of the books in the bookcase, and then Yuri materialized, holding the dagger in one raised hand. His expression was tight. "I promised someone I'd keep this bastard alive," he said. "And I'd really hate to break that promise. So why don't you scamper away the same way you came from, and we can all get back to hating each other in peace." Bias turned to face the trickster, one corner of her mouth tugging up into a smirk. She raised a hand enveloped in elder magic. "Now who is this annoying little spawn, Vestra? A friend of yours?" She laughed gleefully. "How very endearing." Yuri smiled as well, lowering the hand with the dagger to instead raise the other, which was glowing with light magic. "I just love it when confident people underestimate me." With reflexes rivaling those of a cat, Yuri fired a burst of light toward Bias, who ducked to the side, but in the last moment, the light changed its direction and exploded in her face, causing her to shriek and bring her hands to her eyes. Momentarily or not, she had been blinded, and Hubert knew that this was the one chance they would have to get the upper hand. Rather than firing another paralysis spell, he channeled complete darkness and fired it straight toward her, watching as she threw up a haphazard shield that only managed to take the worst brunt of the force. Some of the spell pierced through the barrier, and she stumbled to the side, gasping for air. Pulling her remaining hand from her face, she revealed two hazy eyes, still incapacitated from the intense light. "You will die for this," she wheezed, throwing out an arm to her side, and the candelabra Hubert had lit fell to the floor and immediately set fire to the books that had fallen from the shelves. Yuri threw a dagger in her direction, but she teleported away, and did not reappear. Hubert quickly made his way to the burning books and channeled an elder spell to suffocate the fire. Some of the books were already completely black and unsalvageable, but most had only been somewhat charred by the edges. Now completely drained of his energy, he leaned back against the wall and ran a trembling hand over his head as he met the gaze of the other mage, who had just wrapped the room in a barrier of light that would Hubert suspected stop Bias from simply teleporting in again. He highly doubted she would return, however, they'd outnumbered her and scared her away, for now. "Thank you," Hubert murmured, knowing that he once again owed his life to his reluctant companion. Yuri didn't smile, or smirk, or quip anything searing. He simply nodded. Then he crouched down beside Crow, who lay motionless next to the doorway. Hubert swallowed, watching as Yuri brought his brightly glittering hands to the wolf's torso and closed his eyes. After what felt like an entirely too long moment, he opened his eyes again and gently pressed his hands into the fur near Crow's chest. "He's alive," he said quietly. "Barely. But I can heal him." Hubert exhaled sharply, closing his eyes and running his hand over his face. Somehow, his hexes had failed to alert him to Bias' presence. If Crow hadn't growled when she appeared. Even though Bias had been pushed back for now, he could not consider this a victory, not when he had come so close to failure, and only remained alive to see the light of day again because a wolf who loved him and a man who hated him had saved his life. Yuri gently brushed his right hand against the outside of the drawer, trying to look for hints of dark magic that might be protecting the inside. After a moment, he let his hand fall. "If there ever was some kind of trapping spell here," he said, looking up at Hubert over his shoulder, "it has fizzled out by now." Hubert nodded where he stood with one shoulder leaned against the bookcase. "Good. Can you open the drawers?" Yuri turned back to face the desk's drawers, huffing in amusement as he pulled out a set of lockpicks from within the pouch on his belt. "Oh, please." In less than a minute, he had all three of the drawers unlocked and opened, and had emptied their contents onto the surface of the desk. As he stood up again, Hubert walked over to the desk and inspected the goods. While he examined the couple of envelopes that had been kept in the second drawer, Yuri flipped through the old journal in age-worn leather that had been tucked deeply into the third drawer. He quickly gave up and threw it back onto the desk. "It's in their language," he said as he walked up to face the shelves behind Hubert, inspecting the titles of the books there. They all seemed to be in the foreign language as well. "Can't make heads or tails out of it." From the corner of his eye, he saw Hubert pick up the journal himself and browse through it. Yuri paused to watch as the other man muttered something below his breath before frowning as he followed the foreign words with the tip of his index finger. "You can read it." "I know a fraction of the language," Hubert said distractedly. "Mostly as it relates to ancient magic. I'd need more time to translate it into a whole, time which we currently do not have." He paused, then closed the journal and tucked it within his coat. "Eventually, I shall have every single book here examined, then translate the ones that show potential. For now, however, I shall need to choose carefully which books I bring with me." "And that journal passes the test?" Yuri asked, studying Hubert as he returned his attention to the shelves, but he couldn't see any change in his expression. "Its contents piqued my interest, yes. Must be one hell of a diary." Hubert smiled slightly. "Anyway," Yuri said with a sigh as he turned from the shelves and crouched down to pet Crow, who lay on the floor with his heavy head between his paws. "Exhausted, but alive. Did you find anything? Before you were attacked?" "Nothing regarding curses, I'm afraid." Hubert looked around for something on the floor, then walked over to a book that lay a few paces away. Leaning down to pick it up, he gently brushed some dirt off its front before turning to Yuri again. "You." Yuri's gaze had been following his movement, but he now looked up to meet his eyes. "Yeah," he said. "I think I did." "And?" Yuri gave Crow one last stroke over the head, then got to his feet, weighing his next words carefully. "There's good news and bad news," he said, closely taking in Hubert's reaction as he talked. "The good news is, I actually found 2 different options for dispelling curses. The bad news is what those options are." Hubert raised his eyebrows, but otherwise, there was no sign of surprise or even relief. For now, he tucked that odd bit of intel into the back of his mind, to stew for later. He pulled a book out of his jacket and threw it on the desk, watching Hubert's gaze take in the title, On Hexes and Curses. Either the curse-related memories need to be removed, whatever those memories may be in any particular case, or the original caster has to be the one to dispel the curse. But dispelling a curse requires skill, it's precise and demanding work, and if it fails, it risks just making everything worse. Hubert nodded, looking away as though in deep thought. "I see. It is something, at the very least." Yuri pursed his lips, crossing his arms over his chest as he watched Hubert take the book and tuck it within his own coat before turning back to the shelves. So he wasn't going to say anything more, then? He seriously wasn't going to even hint as to which option he would choose? Well, if he wasn't about to say it on his own. "You're thinking of forcefully removing Constance's memories, aren't you?" He knew that Hubert and Constance had been studying a memory removal spell during the war, but that Constance had ultimately decided not to go through with it, even though it may have rid her of her fear of sunlight. But if removing her memories would also remove the curse Lysias had cast on her? Even if she didn't want to, would Hubert force it on her just to be able to solve his own problems? Hubert didn't show anything on his face. He must have expected the question. "No," he said calmly. "Even if I knew exactly which ones to excise, I would not have Constance's memories manipulated in any way. I closed the door on that option long ago, when I properly realized the risks and consequences of that particular method." Logically, Yuri should be relieved to hear an answer like that, but there was still something that irked him about the whole thing. If he wasn't removing her memories, then... "We have what we came here for," Hubert said suddenly, turning to gather up some more books and a few of the gadgets they'd found in Thal's desk. "We should leave before Bias returns with reinforcements. I'll have some of my spies relocate to guard this area, in case she comes to destroy the contents of this room." Even though Yuri saw it for what it was, a transparent attempt to change the subject before he came too close to the truth, he also knew that Hubert was right. They shouldn't stay here. While they'd been able to handle the Dark Mage once, he didn't think she'd let herself be overwhelmed again. She'd clearly expected Hubert to be alone the first time. She wouldn't make the mistake a second time. On their way out of Shambhala, and through the forests both by foot and eventually on horse, Yuri tried to piece together everything he'd learned from Hubert since the two of them started traveling together. Everything that had seemed odd or out of place, and that hadn't made even an inkling of sense, but that he couldn't believe was just a matter of Hubert's failure to account for everything. He knew enough about Hubert's past to understand that this was a man who never acted without a plan, and usually a couple of additional plans in case the first one failed. But everything that had happened in this case so far seemed so haphazard and illogical, and like he was just grasping for straws. It wasn't until they reached the nearest town early in the morning that it finally clicked. As they dismounted their horses by a small, run-down inn halfway down an empty side street, something caught Yuri's gaze. Releasing his horse's reins, he strode up to the nearby wall of a house and tore down the poster that hung there. Then he shoved it against Hubert's chest. "What the fuck is this?" Frowning, Hubert grabbed the poster made out of thick parchment and examined its front. His eyes widened, and then he raised his gaze to meet Yuri's. "Believe me, I have nothing to do with this." Yuri tore the poster out of his grip and pointed to the drawn image below the words "Wanted," an image that very clearly showed Constance. "Constance von Novelli," he read aloud, "wanted alive, for attempted murder on the Empress of Adrestia. Currently believed to be on her way to Morphise." Gritting his teeth, he clenched the poster in his hand as he glared at the other man. 1 million fucking gold in reward. And you want me to believe this isn't your doing?" Hubert opened his mouth, his expression conflicted as he closed it again. "I can see what this looks like," he said quietly, "but no. I knew nothing about this." "Then it's fucking Edelgard's fault," Yuri growled. As expected, Hubert's gaze instantly darkened. Straightening, he took a step toward him in a clear threat. "Be very careful what words you say next." Yuri let out a frustrated grunt, rolling the poster together before tucking it within his jacket. Hubert's reaction seemed way too sincere to be anything but, and it didn't make any fucking sense. "So if it isn't you, and it isn't your precious emperor, then..." And that's when it hit him. It hit him, and he couldn't believe how stupid he had been not to see it earlier. Gaping, he stared at Hubert as all the pieces of the past weeks finally came together into a coherent whole. Hubert waited in silence, seeming to understand what was happening. "You already knew," Yuri said in disbelief. "Didn't you?" For a long moment, Hubert just looked at him, and Yuri stared back. Everything was quiet but for the soft whinny of one of their horses beside them. Then, without a word, Hubert raised a hand and made a swirling motion in the air. A glittering veil of magic formed in a half-orb around them before it faded out of visibility. "Knew what?" he asked calmly. Yuri looked around, trying to discern the outline of the bubble, but it was completely invisible now. Even when he extended a hand to feel around for some kind of noticeable barrier, he felt nothing. Some kind of privacy spell, to keep their conversation between the two of them? A spell like that sure would have been useful to know. Too bad light magic was based on revealing secrets rather than concealing them. "How to remove the curse," he said as he withdrew his hand and placed it by his hip, focusing once more on Hubert. "That's the missing puzzle piece, and it explains everything I've been struggling to understand until now. Why breaking into and out of the palace was so easy, why you walked knowingly into a trap in Shambhala, why you've taken Constance's escape and journey to Morphise in stride. You want to draw Lysias out, so you can capture him and make him remove the curse." Hubert kept his expression blank, though he let out a small huff that could have been amused. "That is certainly an interesting theory." Now that he'd put the pieces together, the entire scheme was so apparent to him, it just flowed out into words even as he thought them to himself for the first time. "You told Constance that you were going to Shambhala, knowing that she'd tattle about it to Linhard, or whomever happened to be nearby for that matter, so that rumors would eventually start to spread. You hoped this rumor would spread all the way to Thales, and that Lysias would come after you in Shambhala." He paused. "Or, alternatively, that he'd take the opportunity to infiltrate the palace." Hubert crossed his arms over his chest, still showing no sign of relenting, although his gaze did sharpen somewhat. "And telling her that you were going to Shambhala served another purpose as well, didn't it?" You knew that she'd be frustrated, and that she'd likely take any chance she got to break out and search for her own solution. You set up her escape in order to lay another trap for Lysias, an opportunity for him to catch Constance off guard, and for you to learn more about his intention with the curse. Even if Lysias never went after her, she'd eventually turn, and what would she do then? You wanted to see where Dark Constance would go next. And if he had someone to keep an eye on her, someone he trusted, then in Hubert's world, that would be basically risk-free. You said you have someone tailing her. You'd want that person to be capable enough to stay out of sight unless absolutely necessary, but to successfully intervene if Lysias or anyone else tried to kidnap her. I assume you have some spy or other that's perfect for the task. Yuri paused, feeling the wanted poster almost burn against his side within his jacket. While he'd found some satisfaction in finally figuring it out, he suddenly realized another important detail. And this is why you didn't know about the wanted poster, he said, registering the first hint of dismay on Hubert's face. It wasn't you, or maybe even Edelgard, who sent it out. Hubert nodded. It was Lysias, likely while wearing my face. An ice-cold shiver ran along Yuri's spine. Lysias has infiltrated the palace, as you suspected he would. And now, he's trying to get his hands on Constance. At least we know now that he isn't allied with the Dark Mage who has been following Constance and Linhard around, Hubert said with a sigh, causing Yuri to blink at him. Or he wouldn't require the reward posters to bring her back. Say what now? There's a Dark Mage following them around? And that doesn't concern you? Amusement tugged at Hubert's lips. It's under control. As you said, I have a capable spy keeping watch over them. Then, his smile faded again, as he seemed to recall something. However, it's clear that this mage would present a very dangerous threat if he were to turn on them. And therefore, you are taking the next trade ship to Morpheus tomorrow. Yuri frowned. Right, the trade ship that Hubert had secured while they were visiting Ferdinand von Aegir. So even this was part of his scheme, huh? But, you mean you're not going? He asked warily, realizing that there were still details he didn't fully understand. At this, Hubert nodded. I never intended to go to Morpheus, he said softly. My plans do not allow for such a detour. Now that I know for a fact that Lysias has infiltrated the palace, that is where I must go. Hence why you must travel to Morpheus in my stead, to ascertain that the mysterious stranger wielding dark powers does not harm Constance when she is at her most vulnerable. I know too little of his powers to be able to reliably say that my spy would be able to handle him alone, but with you there as well. Wait, hold on, Yuri said, holding up a hand as he tried to wrap his head around it. You're sending me, he said slowly as he held Hubert's gaze, the man who's made it no secret that he's in love with your fiancée, to look after her. He scoffed incredulously. Do you even care to save your relationship anymore, or have you completely given up? Hubert shook his head. You love her, which is exactly why I trust you to keep her safe. Well, that may sound perfectly logical, but was he really so disconnected from his own emotions that he wouldn't even care if Constance ended up with someone else? With his rival? I can't believe I'm saying this, Yuri muttered, but you do know that our previous deal is off? That I may decide to make a move on her this time. The strange man standing in front of him smiled, eyes glittering almost sadly. It was never my intention to force her into anything which she does not want, he said as he turned to his horse, absently stroking its mane while he talked. After the catastrophe at the wedding, I offered her a chance to change her mind and reconsider, and I intend to make good on that promise. However, she is aware that my feelings on the matter are unchanged. In the end, it is up to her what she wants, whom she wants, whether that is me, you, or someone else completely. His smile wavered somewhat. It was clear that he was trying to keep a brave face up. If she chooses you, I shall be graceful about it. At the very least, it would mean that she has chosen someone who truly loves her back. Yuri felt himself frown as he listened to Hubert's response. Someone who truly loves her back. Well, he wasn't wrong about that. He did love Constance. He loved her enough to spend weeks of his life traveling with someone he hated, to keep him safe just for her sake, and he would keep loving her even if she never requited his feelings. But if he had been in Hubert's position, he wasn't so sure he would have been able to risk sending someone else to look after the woman he loved. So was it another part of Hubert's scheme? He tried again to read Hubert's face, to look for hints that he was being dishonest, but all that he found was a certain sadness in his eyes. No. He wouldn't come up with a scheme like that. This was real. Well, he said after a moment of awkward silence between them. I will be the first to admit that I was wrong about you to some extent, Vestra. You have more dignity than I will ever have. Hubert let out a laughter that sounded oddly nervous, a little too loud, a little too sudden. Dignity, he repeated. Not the word I would have chosen, but alas. Another silence lowered itself over them. Feeling that he owed it to the man to change the subject into something less personal, Yuri walked up to his own horse and checked that the reins were secured to the pole. So anyway, he said, how did you learn that Lysias would be able to remove the curse? He glanced at Hubert just in time to see his shoulders relax somewhat. This was what Hubert and Constance used to talk about, right? Dark magic? Should be familiar territory to him. What has been caused by magic can be undone by magic, Hubert murmured, moving his gaze down and to the side as though reminiscing about something. Yuri raised an eyebrow. Excuse me. Fundamental magical theory, Hubert explained as he met his gaze again. All magic systems that I know of build on it. And yet curses are infamous for supposedly being permanent. Any idea as to why? He gave it some honest thought. Curses only existed in dark magic, and most people in Fodlan viewed dark magic as something dangerous and forbidden, hence the name itself. It was obvious, then, who would benefit from spreading the falsehood that curses were permanent. It's what those who slither in the dark want people to believe, he wagered. Hubert inclined his head. The very same conclusion I came to myself. There is no fear quite like the fear of the irreversible, it is why we fear death, after all. And Thales and his ilk prey on people's fear. But what has been caused by magic can be undone by magic, even curses. The more I learned about them, the more apparent it became that there must be a way for mages to remove curses they have cast. Otherwise, there wouldn't exist such ludicrous examples as curses of eternal love. I've suspected it ever since I began my research, but it was never confirmed until now. So you based your entire scheme on a supposition? Yuri let out an incredulous scoff. And if you had turned out to be wrong? Then we would still have a chance to capture Lysias, which would be an advantage in itself. Yuri tried to keep himself from laughing out loud. He looked away from Hubert, letting his hair fall forward to hide his face. I hadn't pegged you for a gambler, Vestra, he drawled. You really must have been desperate to go with a plan like this. Hubert pressed his mouth into a thin line as he steered his gaze forward. Desperate, he murmured. Yes. I suppose that is an apt description. He paused. When you do meet with Constance again, be wary of what information you share with her. Most importantly, do not tell her what we learned in Shamhala. I fear she might do something rash if she finds out prematurely. Yuri sighed, but then nodded reluctantly. Yeah. For once, I think we can agree on that. Chapter 14, Dark Decay. Tapping her fingers nervously against the book held protectively against her chest, Constance paced back and forth through the narrow corridor. Every time that she passed a particular door, she eyed it suspiciously, wondering whether this might be the moment when it would finally open. There were many doors like it in this corridor, unremarkable to the naked eye, little more than broad wooden boards set into the wall. And yet this door concealed dark, terrible secrets that might very well lead to her ruin, if she allowed herself to be pulled in by its horrors. How much longer could they possibly need? Linhard had done very little to assuage her curiosity. In fact, he was the entire reason why she felt this annoying itch in her brain, the reason why her mind wouldn't allow her to relax. I've been thinking about how to proceed with your therapy, and I have an idea. He'd come to her on their second evening in Morpheus, when she had been struggling and failing to work Morphean magic in the interior garden of the inn. At first, his presence had been an exasperating distraction, but then he had managed to capture her interest. The book that Hubert got for you emphasizes the importance of exposure and how that exposure needs to happen in increments. However, with your condition, and considering how the curse seems to work, I've struggled to come up with a way to do that safely. Until now. And then to her appallment, rather than revealing his intentions, he had simply asked her to come to his room in the inn later that afternoon. According to him, it was absolutely vital that she come before sunset. At that, she hadn't been able to do much more than scoff in disbelief, as though she would be able to wait any longer than that. Of course, the thought had struck her that it might be highly improper for her, a noble lady engaged to one of the most powerful men in Adrestia, to rendezvous with another man in the privacy of his own bedroom. However, when she had pointed this out to Linhard, he had frowned, then burst out into unexpected laughter when her meaning seemed to become clear to him. "I assure you, Constance, I have absolutely no interest in you in that way. All I want is to pick your brain, and of course, if the opportunity arose, I wouldn't say no to studying your crest in more detail." At that, she had rolled her eyes and waved him away, assuring him that she would pay him a visit later in the afternoon. However, when she had knocked on his door an hour later, he had simply shouted at her to wait, and then he had forced her to contend with the empty corridor outside the rooms while he proceeded to do Suthies knew what for over a quarter of an hour. Now, perhaps if she had still had her magic, she could have distracted herself with some new spell or other, but since she had yet to unlock the secrets of Morphean magic, she was left with nothing to entertain herself with while she waited. Nothing but her own thoughts. And as minute after minute passed, and she paced back and forth through the corridor, those thoughts only spiraled more and more into the dark crevices of her own mind. What did Linhard plan for her? Would it truly be safe, or would it draw out dark Constance? Would she be forced to face the horrors of her past yet again? With a frustrated grunt, she stopped in front of the dark and terrible door, making 3 rapt and decisive knocks. "1 second," Linhard called from within. She leaned in closer, wanting to see whether she would be able to hear anything that might prepare her for what awaited, but all she could discern were faint murmurs. Then, unexpectedly, the sound of footsteps closed in, and the doorknob turned. Constance jumped back instantly, trying to look innocent as the door swung open to reveal a smiling Linhard. As always, his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and yet this time, she could see a gleam of excitement pass behind them. "You can come in now," he said, stepping aside to allow her entry. She cautiously stepped into the room, taking in the conspicuous white sheets that had been hung up to cover the sole window in the back. On the floor in the middle of the room were 2 large, soft pillows that she supposed were meant to be used as seats. Letting her gaze roam to the other side of the room, she realized with some amount of surprise that they were not alone. Lysithea sat cross-legged on Linhard's bed, leaning over an array of tomes and notebooks that had been spread out over the covers, one of her hands urgently taking notes with a writing quill as her pupils ran from side to side across an open spread. Next to the bed stood Shay, hip leaning against a bedpost as he wearily twiddled a gold coin between his red-clad fingers. She could understand why Linhard had brought Shay, seeing that they risked luring Dark Constance out, but what in the world was Lysithea doing there? Surely she couldn't simply be there to observe them. "Take a seat," Linhard said as he closed the door, gesturing to the pillow closest to them. Eyeing the other 2 people in the room, Constance slowly stepped forward and seated herself on the pillow, legs crossed beneath her and with the book carefully resting beside her. She wouldn't say that she was insecure about their presence, per se, she just wondered, that was all. Linhard sat down on the other pillow, facing her. His gaze lowered to the book by her side for a moment before meeting her eyes. "Last time I tried to help you, things didn't exactly turn out perfect. I think we made some important progress, but maybe we were a little too quick to rush ahead when really we should have taken it slow." He paused as though to give her an opportunity to respond, but Constance simply waited in silence, still wary of his intentions. "So I thought back to what I read in that book," he said, eyeing her treasure again, the only thing she had with her that connected her to Hubert, and she had to resist the impulse to conceal it behind her back. "And I realized the problem is twofold. I do think you need to face your own thoughts and feelings head-on at some point, but there's also the issue of the sun and the instant, guttural reaction it draws out of you. Starting with the instinctive part of your trauma, and trying to teach your brain that there's really nothing to be afraid of, seems logical to me." He paused again, but this time it seemed to be more out of discomfort than respect for her, as he looked away to the side and shifted on the pillow. "I think I have an idea of what your fear of the sun stems from," he said softly. "But before we go into that territory, I suggest we start with something a little more basic." Returning his gaze to her eyes again, he lifted a hand in front of him, palm facing upward. With a murmured word and the brief appearance of a faith magic circle, an orb of light came into existence and began to hover just above his palm. Constance looked at the orb, feeling a faint warmth spread through her body at the sight. "This is a simple ball of light," Linhard said, gaze fixed on her face. "And judging by your reaction, it doesn't seem to make you uncomfortable. I mean, I used it several times during our journey to light our surroundings, and you never complained." "Why would I?" she asked softly, still gazing into the light. It was faint enough that she could stare right at it without harming her eyes. "Well," Linhard seemed momentarily taken aback by her response, as though he was struggling to phrase his thoughts into words. "Let me ask, how do you feel about this light here?" It was a strange question to ask, but she supposed she should give Linhard a chance to prove that aiding her was time well spent. So she took a couple of slow, deep breaths and tried to interpret her reaction to the light. The warmth that had immediately wrapped her in its safe embrace was not new, she could remember having felt a similar way before. Several times, in fact, but one of those moments had been stronger than the others. She closed her eyes, but she could still sense the light in front of her. Frowning, she grasped for the warm sensation, hoping that it would lead her to the right memory. A ball of light, whisking away the darkness and the loneliness. Although she usually felt at ease in the shadows, there had been times when that darkness had threatened to swallow her whole. When her mind had just about given in to despair, to hopelessness, and there had seemed to be no way out. She could remember feeling something akin to that despair in the cold darkness of Shambhala. Waking up from a nightmare, no, from Hubert's communication with her in her dreams and feeling horribly out of her depth. Then, a little while later, when they faced Lysias, and she and Hubert had been too exhausted to do much at all in the face of his elder powers. And more recently, in a dark cell beneath the ground, locked behind bars by the very man whom she loved, her energy reserves completely blocked and with an immense sensation of powerlessness in the face of her own doom. She had felt cold, lonely, torn, and afraid. Hopeless. And then, a light. Constance inhaled a trembling breath, then swallowed down a lump in her throat as she realized why Linhard's orb of light had made her feel what she did. She opened her eyes. "I feel safe," she said softly. "As though I am no longer alone with my anxiety. As though, aid is coming." She could remember seeing a familiar face on the other side of the bars in the dungeons, lit up by his very own light magic, could remember breaking into tears in sheer relief. Linhard raised his eyebrows, but he didn't comment on the clear contradiction that she could now see as well as he must do. She was afraid of the sun, but felt safe and protected within magical light. She couldn't recall whether she had always felt that way, or whether it was something that had grown slowly in the years since she moved into Abyss, as she steadily grew to depend on the aggravating yet quietly kind Lord of the Underground. All she knew was that he, and the light he brought with him, always made her circumstances feel a little bit less hopeless. "Interesting," Linhard said after another moment. "Do you know why that is?" She swallowed, glancing at his face. "I believe I do." "All right, good," Linhard said eagerly. "You don't need to tell me about it. Either way, it's great news, because it means my idea might just work." He inclined his head to the bed. "Lysithea, I'll need you in a bit," said Mage sighed, but began to climb off the bed. Meanwhile, Linhard guided the ball of light toward the sheets behind him. "Like I said, this is just a simple light spell," he said as the ball disappeared behind the edge of the sheet by the window and rose up until it was about halfway behind the sheet, shining dimly through the fabric. "It's a cloudy day today, and even if it hadn't been, the sun never shines through the windows on this side of the inn. At no point during this session will you ever see the real sun." "All right." Constance nodded slowly. She could already see where Linhard was heading with this, but she was doubtful that it would work. "Okay," Linhard continued. "We've agreed that it's not the sun. But we're going to pretend that it is, and for that, I'll need Lysithea's help." Lysithea had walked up to stand by the sheet now, arms crossed as she glared at the back of Linhard's head. "Of all the things to need my assistance with, you give me the simplest, most dull assignment I could possibly imagine. Any black mage could have done this. Literally anyone." I know," Linhard said with a small sigh, "but do you see anyone else here with that ability?" "No. Then stop complaining. I said I'd help you with your crest research later in return. Lysithea pursed her lips, but remained silent. Constance peered up at her. Any black mage, What exactly had Linhard asked her to do? If she had to wager a guess, she would say that it must have something to do with fire, the element that was usually first introduced to new black mages. Even Hubert knew how to cast simple fire spells, and his main magical focus had always been elsewhere. I'll need your help in a second. But before that, Linhard made a gentle motion with his hand toward the sheet, and the orb of light slowly brightened in strength. Constance's gaze was automatically drawn to the light, and to her slight surprise, she began to feel a twinge of anxiety within her chest. Not the sun. I know that it is not the sun. Then anxiety was dampened slightly by that thought. If at any point you feel that the curse is about to take over, tell me and I'll stop immediately, Linhard said. We also have Shay here in case worse comes to worst. But for now, I want you to look toward the light, and focus on whatever it is that makes you feel calm and safe in its presence. Can you do that? Nodding, Constance took a deep breath and continued gazing toward the light as she thought about the moments where Yuri's brightness had brought her relief. The memory that was the closest at hand was the time in the dungeons, when she had woken up in hopeless darkness, uncertain what to do next, and stumbled around in the dark underground cell as she tried to find some way to light her surroundings. And then that light had appeared, bright and strong, just outside the cell. The relief she had felt at that moment was indescribable. It was strange, perhaps, that the sight of a particular person could bring her such calmness. Surely it hadn't always been like that. She could definitely remember moments in the past where seeing Yuri had simply made her annoyed, or in the very beginning of their acquaintance even anxious. But a shift had taken place somewhere, at some point, wherein Yuri's presence had gone from exasperating to calming. It had to have been before they entered into their little arrangement. She could not imagine that she would have ever done such a thing with him unless she already felt safe around him at that point. Was it, after she had learned of Lady Edelgard's true intentions? Hubert had teleported her into Abyss so that she could convince Yuri to join sides with the Empire, and she had rushed through the crowd on Burrow Street in search of the trickster. But no. At that point, although she had perhaps held a certain trust in him, that was before the change. Then, was it the fact that he had successfully convinced Lady Rhea that he was on her side? Was it the fact that he had proven useful at last? No, that could not be it, either. But she knew that she was coming closer to the true answer. Soon after he had spoken with Lady Rhea, and shortly before war broke out, she had been gripped by an almost paralyzing anxiety. At the brink of war, she had found herself wondering whether anyone would remember her. Whether all that she had accomplished or failed to accomplish up to that point would all be for naught. Even now that she drew it to her mind, she could feel the anxiety creep up on her again. Breathing deeply, she kept staring into the light. During that time, when anxiety had held its claws wrapped around her, Yuri had granted her access to his personal little space in Abyss. He had given her a key to the small room with colorful fabrics and lively green plants, and he had done something for her that had blown away her thoughts of the war and its horrors, if temporarily. Constance von Novelli, Anno 1161. As lovely as she is fierce, a truly magnificent mage, and the most persistent and headstrong woman I've ever had the pleasure to know. If, at times, a bit naive. To think that she could remember it verbatim, so many years after the fact, the words that Yuri had recorded about her in his worn notebook in an effort to grant her some relief. The words, while sweet, meant little in the grand scheme of things. It was the gesture itself that had managed to break through her preconceptions about him, the fact that he cared enough about her to take the time to console and comfort her even when he had so much to do and prepare before war would break out later that night. He hadn't needed to channel any orbs of light then, it had been enough that he proved to her that he could be trusted, that he would be there for her, that she could count on his aid. It was only later that she had begun to associate him with light itself. She could not remember exactly when or how that had happened. Only that now, when she saw an orb of magical light, her thoughts were drawn to Yuri and instant calmness wrapped itself around her. Staring into the light, she felt herself begin to smile as she allowed her thoughts to remain in that moment down in Yuri's private room, when he had brought her relief in a moment of great apprehension before her uncertain future. Even when Linhard continued to brighten the light, she was able to hold on to her hope and calmness. But then, this wasn't truly the sun, so how much progress were they actually making? "How are you doing?" Linhard asked, momentarily pulling her out of her own thoughts. "Perfectly fine, thank you," she said. "Are you certain that this is effective? We'll just have to take it a step further and see. Close your eyes." She let her eyes flutter closed. The light was strong enough that she could still discern it through her closed eyelids, but since she was well aware that it was simply magical light, she could keep the dull anxiety in her chest at bay with continued thoughts of Yuri. Of the small smile on his face as he'd wrapped an arm around her, on the mattress in his private room. "I don't plan on sticking around to write your name after you die. If we die together." "Lysithea," Linhard's voice said. There was a rustling sound, as though of clothing. A few seconds later, Constance could feel a warmth start to bloom on her face and neck. A very, very familiar warmth. And without warning, anxiety struck her hard. The blade of a sword, gleaming in blood, glittering in the first rays of the sun. Gasping, she opened her eyes, hands shooting out to clench at the pillow at her sides as she tried to push down the anxiety that had quickly begun to build up. The light behind the sheet, that had brought her relief just a moment earlier, now only reminded her of the burning terror of a clear sky. Her wide-eyed gaze was drawn to Lysithea, who had extended a hand toward her, a hand enveloped by a magical circle. The warmth she had felt, a warmth that was incredibly reminiscent of the beams of the sun, clearly emanated from Lysithea's palm. "Stop," Constance gasped as the darkness of the curse threatened to take her over, and the warmth quickly faded away as Lysithea let her hand fall. At the same time, Linhard smothered the orb of light completely. The anxiety, while now kept at bay, was slower to sink away. The curse was still close as well, lurking just at the edge of her attention. She leaned forward, palms slapping against the floor as she tried to fight it back. She could see Shay tense by the bed. "Wait," Linhard said, holding up a hand in the mercenary's direction. "Constance, are you managing?" "Yes." With a small whine, she lifted her head to look up at him. "But what? Why?" He was wearing a frown, not out of concern for her, it seemed like, but rather because he was thinking deeply. "I had the thought that we might be able to create the illusion of sunlight if we added fire to my light spell," he said. "It did seem to work, but maybe a bit too well." "A bit too well," she exclaimed, straightening so that she could glare at him properly. "I very nearly turned right then. Take care to be a tad more precautious in the future, if you please." "Point taken," he said simply. He glanced in Lysithea's direction before turning back to face Constance with a smile. "But don't you see? I've figured out a way to expose you to sunlight under controlled conditions. Now we can continue with your therapy, on our terms." Constance huffed as she crossed her arms over her chest. "I suppose. Is that your plan, then? To expose me to artificial sunlight until I have become used to its presence?" Linhard shook his head. "Not exactly. My idea is to have you focus on the calming thoughts brought to you by the light of my spell, while we slowly increase its likeness to the sun. I believe that if we do this enough times, we might be able to rewire your brain into associating the sun with something positive rather than with your traumatic memories. And perhaps, when we've come a bit further, we might even be able to talk more about the cause of your trauma without having to worry about the curse taking you over." Chewing on the inside of her cheek, Constance lowered her gaze to the book by her side. "Associate the sun with something positive." Hubert's notes to her within its pages seemed to scream at her, even though they were carefully hidden with both visible ink and charms that assured only she and him would be able to read them. Linhard's plan seemed logical, perhaps, but was it appropriate to have these thoughts about Yuri, when she was engaged to Hubert? There was nothing inherently romantic about the thoughts themselves, but it was still fact that they were connected to her relationship with Yuri, which had at one point been, if not romantic, then at the very least physical. And she now used her memories of him to grant her strength in the face of one of her greatest enemies, the sun. And now, if Linhard had his way, she was supposed to train her brain into associating the sun itself with Yuri. Was that truly acceptable? "You don't think it's a good idea?" Linhard asked quietly, and she was half surprised that he even bothered to consult her feelings on the matter. With a soft sigh, she lifted her gaze to meet his eyes. "I suppose it is the only alternative we have," she acknowledged. "I must confess that the idea and setup is rather clever, although I would prefer if you were completely honest with me about your intentions henceforth." Linhard smiled, an eager gleam passing behind his gaze. "It's a deal. We'll keep at it, and before you know it, you'll be taking walks in the sun to relax." She huffed at him and rolled her eyes, but deep within the confines of her mind, she couldn't help but feel a spark of hope at his words. "No new movements in the vicinity as far as we have been able to discern. The rumors we heard of suspicious activity turned out to be just that, mere baseless rumors." "I see. And what of Constance?" "I expect such a large sum of reward money would catch the attention of bounty hunters." "Ah yes, it seems to have stirred up quite the commotion. I have some of my best people sorting through the intel we have received since we went public with the bounty. So far, all of them have been false positives as to be expected." Lady Edelgard nodded, her lips tightly pressed together as she gazed out across the throne room. For a moment, she was clearly thinking hard, her forehead furrowing in deep thought. But then she sighed and let her shoulders fall as her gaze returned to him. "While I grasp the necessity of our actions, I cannot help but feel guilty that we may have robbed her of her very last chance to restore her heritage to its former glory. It may take a lifetime of work for her to rebuild her reputation after this, if not centuries, and yet," she trailed off with another deep sigh. "With all due respect, Your Majesty," he said with a bow, "you needn't carry the burden on your shoulders. I made the judgment, and I gave the order." "With my approval," she interjected, causing him to fall silent for a beat. When he regained himself, he gave her what he imagined would land somewhere in the territory of a mournful yet ironic smile. "Would you prefer I act alone and in the shadows? I seem to recall you asking me to be more forthcoming with my schemes, but if you would rather be spared the unnecessary details, that can certainly be arranged." She gave him a sharp look. "This is hardly an unnecessary detail, Hubert. We are speaking of the future of a dear friend and, in your case, a beloved. Do not make light of it." Expression turning grim, he gave another bow, this one shallow. "Of course, Your Majesty. Forgive me. I." He paused, looking away for a moment as he gathered his thoughts. He could feel Edelgard's gaze burn into his skin. "This is a novel experience for me as well, and I confess I am not without guilt myself. However," returning his gaze to meet hers, he discreetly clenched his fists by his sides as he made certain to leak some emotion into his voice. "This is for her sake as well," he said intently. "It is the only way to help her become herself again. I shall have her returned to us, and I shall solve the mystery of the curse. That is what I owe her for pulling her with me into this war, and it is what I owe you for ever allowing it to go this far. Leave this to me, Lady Edelgard, I will not disappoint you this time." Edelgard's gaze was conflicted as she listened to his declaration, her teeth absently chewing on the inside of her bottom lip, a subtle tick he'd learned meant that she was holding something back from him. For now, however, he didn't see a reason to push her. It seemed reasonable for her to be hesitant in this situation. "Thank you, Hubert," she said quietly, gaze falling away from him as she spoke. "I have faith in your judgment." He bowed again before turning on his heel and striding toward the double doors to the throne room. As he pushed the doors open, he allowed himself a brief smirk. "You truly do, don't you, Empress?" Her trust in him might have sent alarm bells ringing if it hadn't been for the fact that she still insisted on testing his identity every time that they spoke with each other, a test that he had been prepared for, and that he had taken the time to learn inside and out before even setting foot in the palace. As he nodded curtly to the guards outside the doors, he felt a shiver run along the back of his neck. Hesitating only briefly, he steered his steps to the right rather than straight forward. He had intended to check in with the Vestra engineers after this, but he couldn't afford to ignore the warning signs given to him by his own spell work. Besides, he had some paperwork to go through in his study at any rate, he could just as well get it over with sooner rather than later. The closer he came to the study, the fewer and farther between became the roaming servants. However, when he turned the next corner into an otherwise empty corridor, his instincts whispered to him that he was no longer alone. "Ah," he said without lowering his pace, his gaze kept straight ahead. "You're back. From inside a shadowed doorway stepped a graceful figure clad in practical clothes and a cowled cape, the cowl in question pulled over her head to conceal some of her face from his view. Like his own shadow, she easily fell into step beside him. "Lord Vestra," she greeted in a quiet yet firm voice. "I have an urgent report." "Urgent, That sounded promising if slightly ominous. But then, ominous was one of the things which she did best. "We are nearly by my study. Let us discuss the matter there." "No." The decisiveness with which she delivered her disagreement caused him to halt. As she stopped a few paces ahead and turned around to face him, his gaze lowered to meet her eyes. She looked dead serious, with no hint as to her intentions. While he tried to make a guess as to what could be so urgent that she couldn't even wait a couple of minutes to bring it up, she extended an arm toward an open doorway to his right. "After you, my lord." Reluctantly tearing his gaze away from her, he turned and stepped into the room, waving his hand in the air to set up a privacy spell around them as she used black magic to light the candelabras in the room. After they had both made certain that no one was lurking anywhere within the boundaries of the spell, Lysias turned toward Bias with his arms crossed over his chest. "This will need to be quick, my disguise is nearing its end. We shall need to fall back and regroup," she said, wasting no time to get to the point. "The odds have turned against us. You shall go to your chambers with haste and bring only the most vital belongings with you before we leave the palace." Lysias paused, feeling his eyebrows rise as his forehead furrowed. He had expected a report from Shamhala, perhaps even some bad news regarding Hubert's progress, but not this. "Sorry." He let out a disbelieving laughter. "And to what do we owe this sudden change of plans, if I may ask?" "You may not," she snapped. "That information is strictly confidential." He held her gaze for a moment. Strictly confidential, supposedly meaning that no one but Thales and his closest, most trusted commanders were authorized to know. "I see," he said, tilting his head to the side as he studied Bias. He prided himself on being able to read and correctly interpret practically anyone's state of mind and intentions, if given enough time. The twitch of a minor muscle, the nervous shift of weight from one leg to the other, a barely discernible widening of the eyes. Most people mindlessly revealed their inner thoughts on their faces or in their body language, almost as though they wanted him to know everything about them. Even those who clearly wished they could conceal things from him were usually easy to figure out. Bias, however. With her many years of experience as an Agarthan commander and impersonator, she had nearly complete control over her own expressions and body language. If she did not want you to know what she thought on a matter, you wouldn't. If she wanted you to think that she felt something other than she actually did, that was what you would think. Still, he was convinced that even Bias had her ticks and tells, and after months of closely working together with her, he believed that he was on his way to figuring them out. Relaxing his shoulders, he turned and walked over to a nearby side table, where a fresh bouquet of pink and white roses had been captured in a tall vase. He studied the intricate patterns of veins on the leaves as he considered what little information he had. Bias had returned from a seemingly failed mission in Shamhala. Whether or not she had actually encountered Hubert there was unconfirmed as of yet. However, mere minutes after her return, she had ordered him to put their plans on hold and leave the palace, effectively rendering all of their careful preparations as well as the structure they had built up within the palace to come to waste. Assuming that Thales was involved in this decision, Lysias could only imagine that whatever had caused them to change their mind so suddenly under such otherwise perfectly laid out circumstances was dangerous enough to warrant extreme caution. He had to assume that it was connected to Shamhala somehow. Had Hubert been able to gain the upper hand? Perhaps he had stumbled upon a powerful Agarthan weapon? The man knew their language, after all. He would be able to study their technology and use it for his own gains, given enough time. Something happened in Shamhala, then, he wagered, casually rearranging the roses as he spoke. Hubert uncovered something, a weapon of some kind. Is that right? He could hear the exasperation in her voice when she replied, although that might just be an act, he never knew with Bias. Vestra managed to steal something very dangerous from Shamhala, she confirmed in a low voice. Something powerful enough to turn the tides. Something which, if we allow him to make use of it, could spell the end of an era. Lysias smiled softly. So that was it, then. A weapon. It seemed almost too simple. So simple, in fact, that it might be just another cover-up. But why lie about something like that? Why not tell him the real truth about why their plans suddenly needed to change? No, it made sense that Hubert had found something in Shambhala. After all, why else would Bias be this adamant so soon after her return from the underground city? And yet she had been so quick to latch onto his assumption, relieved, almost. He plucked a petal from one of the roses, then removed his right glove so that he could rub it between his thumb and forefinger as he considered his options. The petal was smooth to the touch, like silk. Its light pink color contrasted sharply with his blackened fingertips. Even as Hubert, he couldn't escape the dark decay. Then let us not give him a chance to use it, he said. Bias let out a soft yelp in disbelief, but he continued before she could argue, turning to face her with a slight smile. I have only the greatest of respect for you and Thales, Lady Bias, he said, and I'm certain that what you say is entirely true. However, I'm not pulling back now. We have a solid strategy. Hubert is severely underpowered against us, and even if he knows about our infiltration, I highly doubt that he ever foresaw its true extent. When he eventually returns to the palace, we'll take him out before Edelgard can even blink regardless of what weapons he may possess. I am confident about that. Bias narrowed her eyes. Yes, she said dryly. You tend to be, little whelp. However, this decision is not up to you, and Thales does not take disobedience lightly. Thales ordered this operation, and I am seeing it through to the end. If he has issues with that, he can take it directly with me after I've achieved what I came here to do. As Bias very nearly snarled at him, he held her gaze steadily, one eyebrow raised in a silent challenge. You know as well as I do that there is nothing Thales can do to stop me if he ever wants another chance to achieve his ultimate goal. Except, of course, forcefully and discreetly removing Lysias from the palace, but doing so would have serious repercussions, something which Thales was well aware of. I don't mean to be disrespectful, he continued smoothly, turning back to face the vase when Bias stayed deadly silent. I am simply confident in my abilities. And so should you be. You know what I am capable of. In particular, you know that Thales would not invite someone so young to join his inner circle unless he had faith that I would be a capable commander, on par even with you. He did not need to turn his head to know that Bias was likely gritting her teeth. Smiling to himself, he plucked a pink rose from the vase and offered it to her. She merely sneered at the flower. Besides, he said, lowering his gaze to the petals as he silently called on his magic, I have unfinished business with a certain noblewoman. Feeling the words sour in his own mouth, he watched as the rosy petals darkened and curled outward, until one of them loosened and sailed to the floor. At that point, he twirled the stem between his fingers for a brief moment before tucking the rose back into the vase. There it stood, dark and rotten, trying to blend in with the fresh flowers around it. They wouldn't withstand the magical rot for long, though. In an hour's time, they would all be ready to keel over. One of the other roses was already beginning to droop somewhat. Lysias smiled as he watched the darkness spread. Casually pricking the tip of his index finger on one of the rose thorns to draw blood, he murmured a few well-chosen Agarthan words and channeled his magic. A couple of seconds later, the roses looked as fresh and healthy as ever. If one gazed beyond the first impression, however, one would find that it was merely a trick of the eye, and the decay still remained just beneath the surface. Your personal investment in the operation makes it all the more precarious, Bias cautioned. No, he said. It simply motivates me to succeed whatever the cost. Standing back, his smile slowly faded as he considered the now inconspicuous vase with its fresh roses in white and pink. He had initially hoped that the curse he placed on Constance would destroy the royal palace from within, like black mold taking over and spreading its spores onto everything around it. He still wasn't entirely certain where it had all gone wrong, but it no longer mattered. All that mattered was that he would soon have her in his grasp, and when he did, he would make her pay for what she had done. He would draw the truth out of her, force her to face the consequences of her actions, and then watch with a smile as she lost the very last remnant of who she had been to everlasting darkness. His decay may be hidden for now, but that made it no less destructive. Our plans will continue moving forward as intended, he announced as he turned back to face Bias, who wore a dark expression beneath the rim of her hood. However, we will need to account for the unexpected turn of events in Shamhala. In other words, clean up your mess. What is it they say? Offense is the best defense. He put on his glove again, making a firm tug to get it in place as he walked past Bias on his way to the door. Her soft footsteps followed his, and she sighed, but she didn't argue a detail he more than well picked up on. When he reached the doorway, and before they left the boundaries of the privacy spell, he turned to face her once more. "Did I truly convince you, Lady Bias?" he asked, watching her lift her gaze to meet his. "I find that difficult to believe." She exhaled softly as she shook her head. A moment later, a slow smile spread on her lips. "I do not agree with your judgment, which you have made on the basis of incomplete information. And yet it is quite clear that my opinion is of little use to you. So be it, I will not stand in your way, and I will play along with your schemes. I must confess that I am also curious to see how this will end." Her smile faded, gaze becoming dark and intense. "But let me be clear, whelp, if your recklessness ends up compromising Thales's ultimate goal, your life will be forfeit." Lysias held her gaze for another moment as her words sank in. There was no doubt that she was telling the truth, and that her faith in him was fragile at best. Whatever weapon had been stolen from Shamhala, he definitely shouldn't underestimate it. He should take Bias' warning seriously and let it inform his decisions going forward. He nodded firmly. "A fair condition. I do appreciate your candor. Although I suppose I needn't remind you that I wouldn't need to make my decisions based on incomplete information, if you didn't insist on keeping me in the dark." Bias scoffed. "The information remains strictly confidential, however much you whine about it." Even now, she insisted on keeping things from him. It truly must be damning information, if she was willing to sacrifice Thales's plans in order to keep it a secret. He was just about to reply when an uncomfortable tingle blazed along the top of his spine. Cutting himself off, he automatically brought a hand to the back of his neck. "As much as I enjoyed our conversation," he said, "I'm afraid my time has run out." Before she could reply, he turned and strode out into the hallway, leaving the safety of his privacy spell behind and letting it fizzle as he stepped out of its reach. Bias followed close behind for a short while, then parted ways to blend with the shadows after another moment. Lysias increased his pace, grimacing against the increasing pain in his spine and neck. In this state, caught in the final moments before the illusion wore off, his magic was always unreliable, and so he didn't dare attempt a teleportation spell, lest he wanted to find himself fully disillusioned in the middle of the throne room. "Hey, Hubert. For the love of everything unholy." Clenching his jaw, he forced himself to acknowledge the man approaching from the other direction. "Sylvain," he said without stopping. "Good evening." The redhead slowed his own pace, clearly indicating he wished to talk. "Do you have a moment?" "No." "All right, but I just need to know if you have any news on Constance." Lysias reluctantly halted his movement just as he was about to push past him. Keeping his expression calm even as his spine was burning, he faced Sylvain more slowly than he really had the time for. "Not yet, I'm afraid." Sylvain furrowed his brow in concern. While Lysias needed to escape into the privacy of his chambers as soon as possible, he knew better than to simply shrug this man off. Initially, based on the rumors about him, he'd assumed that he would simply be an annoying pest. However, he'd soon realized that there was more to Sylvain Gautier than Sylvain himself wanted people to know. Where many others still seemed to see a simple-minded womanizer which, considering his recent marriage, said something about just how effective the rumors had been during his time as a bachelor, it was clear that he had a sharp intellect and an eye for details that most people of his kind seemed to lack. He was a threat that should not be underestimated. "Are you all right?" he asked now, proving again just how keen his eye was. "You look like you have one foot in the grave." "I'm simply tired," Lysias replied. "Now if you'll excuse me." "All right," Sylvain said reluctantly as Lysias politely but firmly pushed past him. "Keep me updated." Lysias inclined his head to the other man, offering a short smile before he continued hastily down the corridor, a single bead of sweat running down his cheek. Chapter 15, A Dream of Life. Holding her palms above the surface of the calm pond, Constance struggled fervently not to use her willpower against the water. It went against everything she had learned about magic from the top professors at the Royal School of Sorcery, from her very own parents and grandparents, as well as from the mage professors at Garreg Mach, and how formulas required precision, intention, and above all willpower. Constance von Novelli, with her pride and confidence, had been a natural at all these things, but here, in Morpheus, those traits suddenly placed her at a disadvantage. Her arms were beginning to ache from being held in such a static position with no changes, and with a frustrated huff, she withdrew them to her lap for a short rest. From the corner of her eye, she could see Shayshift where he leaned against the nearby wall. Based on what she knew about him so far, she assumed he must be quite weary at this point. She tried not to let it get to her. After all, he was paid handsomely for his services as her personal guard. Even her head was starting to ache now, after all the frowning she had done at the uncooperative pond water. Modesty. HMPF. How was she supposed to succeed with anything while being modest? If she did not have faith in her own skills, in her ability to succeed, how would she ever be able to cast a spell? Well, perhaps cast a spell was not entirely the correct way to describe it, she thought bitterly. The last time that she had spoken with Androtimos, she had complained about the impossibility that was Morphean spellcasting, and he had gone on to correct her. It is not spellcasting, he had said, so much as it is channeling the magical capabilities of nature. You do not shape and control spells as with Faudlane's magic, rather, you pave the way for the intentions of the elements. When she had expressed frustration at his unclear statement, he had added, you cannot command water to create fire, and the sun will never cool your skin. Ask only for what the elements can and wish to supply. This was something else which she had been struggling to wrap her head around. While it made a certain amount of sense that water could not be used to create fire, and thus that she would need to adapt her expectations to the available elements around her, it clarified nothing as regarded the method of channeling Morphean magic. How was she supposed to ask the elements? The closest thing she had come to anything akin to that before was the prayers which needed to be part of every faith spell. However, those prayers were simply a formulaic necessity. The content of the spell itself had nothing at all to do with the prayers that finalized the formula. And yet here, in Morphean magic, it seemed absolutely vital that she relinquished control to nature, that she asked rather than commanded. But how? How could Morphean magic be seen as reliable at all, if one was inherently dependent on the whims of the elements? How could any Morphe parents ever allow their children to play atop the rooftops, when the wind could suddenly decide not to answer their call just as they jumped off a building? There must be something here that she was missing. She sighed as she lowered her gaze to the small wooden ball lying next to her on the floor. After his repeated attempts at explaining the mindset to her had proven unsuccessful, Androtimos had shown her this very ball, holding it up in his open palm. Imagine that this is one of the elements, he had said. The ball longs for the earth, it is pushing against my palm, because it is drawn downward by gravity. I cannot command it to move from my palm by mere strength of will, regardless of how much I might wish to. However, here, he had angled his palm slightly so that it tilted down toward his arm, and the ball had begun to roll down from his hand. He had balanced it on his arm, then caught it with his other hand just before the ball reached the bend of his arm. I can guide it in a certain direction, he had continued as he offered her the ball with a gentle smile. It is the same with Morphean magic, you do not command the magic to act, but rather guide it in any of the various directions it can flow. Constance took the ball and weighed it in her palm as she thought back to Androdimos' demonstration. It had clarified the method for her somewhat, at least in theory, but she was still at a loss as to how to implement that method in practice. Of course, she knew how to guide the wooden ball down along her arm, but how would that translate to, say, guiding the water in the pond to rise and become mist? She pondered this as she let the ball roll from one hand to the other, then back again. The ball longs for the earth. What did the water long for, and how would she help it get there? It was a preposterous question to ask, and one she would have easily scoffed at just a few weeks ago. But if this was what it would take to master the elements in the Morphean way. Placing the ball beside her on the floor again, Constance leaned forward to rake the surface of the pond with her fingertips, creating temporary little patterns in the water, which quickly filled in the gaps left by her fingers and sent soft waves rippling across the surface. The water wanted to be whole. The drops of water wanted to be together, and yet from her experience, water could be rather flexible as well, even playful at times. She lowered her hand a little more deeply into the water, then splashed up a wave toward the other side of the pond. Thousands, perhaps millions, of water droplets burst up into the air around the wave before quickly arching back into the pond. The droplets seemed almost as though they wanted to continue up into the air, but they needed a push. Just a gentle nudge, from someone who could guide them in the right direction. And yet when she tried to make that happen, she automatically resorted to her own willpower, and the emptied energy reserves within her did not allow for such magic to be cast. She needed to master the Morphean magic, she needed to be modest. There was, of course, a way in which she could easily become modest. However, in order to achieve that level of modesty, she would need to take a risk. She glanced furtively in Shay's direction and caught him in the middle of a large yawn. When he noticed that she was watching him, he immediately straightened and cleared his throat. He seemed attentive enough, it was time to put her most recent theory to the test. Returning her attention to the pond, Constance inhaled deeply, relaxing her shoulders. As she extended her hands over the water again, she closed her eyes. Then she forced herself to think back to that fateful night 10 years ago. Back to her old bedroom, dark and cool in the night. To the sound of shouts that had woken her up, and an unnatural orange light source flickering against the walls on the opposite side of the windows, reaching even through the drapes. To her naked feet running across the floor, down the wide staircase, through room after room in search of anyone to ask what was happening and out into the gardens, where Constance let out an involuntary whine, grimacing as her mind instinctively tried to push her back and shut her out. But no, she would stand tall, she would make it. She remembered how she had run out into the gardens, and smoke and fire had been painted on the horizon. At first, her mind had interpreted it as the sun and perhaps mist, then possibly a forest fire far in the distance, until she heard the sound of cannons too nearby followed by more shouts, this time in familiar voices. And shortly thereafter, metal sliding against metal, a sound she recognized well from her weekly sparring sessions with her brother. Her feet had brought her automatically toward the side gates where the sound came from, stumbling forward mindlessly through the perfectly tended gardens as her sleep-addled mind still struggled to wrap itself around what was happening. The cool morning breeze had rustled her nightgown around her naked legs, causing her to shiver as she ran. By sunrise. By sunrise. As the sun rose on the horizon, cresting the rooftops, she had finally reached the gates, and swung them open, and immediately stumbled into a scene so gruesome that she could hardly remember anything but a chaos of blurry details. Metal, the blade of a sword covered in. No, she whispered, feeling her hands tremble in the air. In blood, in red blood, and it was the blood of her brother, of Maximilian of Max and End. She tried to breathe, tried to focus, tried to keep herself in check, but the image was so powerful, it was so burned into her inner eye, and now that she had allowed it to come forth, she could not be rid of it. The water, she tried to think, concentrate on the water, make it rise at once into the air, and continue upward. But there was only blood, red blood, and it was gleaming in sunlight. Please, she thought desperately as she tried to focus on the water below her hovering palms, I mean, this is what you want, is it not? You wish to be free, to play and be free, so please. Please heed my wishes. Please play with me. And yet what did she know of its wishes? What right did she have to ask that the water share those wishes with her? Please, tell me. She gasped as another image struck her, the shape of a man, of her brother, falling to his knees, and a blade sliding out easily from his chest, gleaming red with blood in the bright beams of the morning sun. Please, I understand that asking this might be a burden on you, a burden that you are by no means required to carry for me, and yet I ask that you heed my wish, so that we shall both be merrier in return. She did not will the water to move, nor did she command it, she simply asked nicely, wishing and hoping that it would agree with her intentions. She asked what the droplets of water wished for, and she hoped that they would achieve it with her aid. Whatever it is that you truly wish for, she thought as she struggled against the vivid memories of her past, I can help you reach your aims, I can lead you right. And as her strength seemed to seep out of her in exchange for growing darkness, she felt as though something changed in her mind, something clicked into place, and there was a gentle sucking sensation in her hand, a tingling feeling in her palm, and a cool spray against her skin. And then there was only a pair of black eyes and a darkly amused smirk, and she felt something give way as a sardonic laughter echoed through her mind. Your brightest future is right here, by my side. When she came to again, it took her a moment to understand where she was. Her cheek was pressed against something cold, and the world around her looked strange and wrong, and it was only when she heard a voice behind her and felt something press against her back that she realized that she was lying on her stomach on the floor. You back yet? She groaned softly, trying to sit up, but the weight just continued to press down on her back. What who? You changed again, the voice said, and now she could recognize it as Shay's voice. You good now? She stared in the direction of the pond a few feet away, trying to grasp hold of reality again. The struggle against her past, and against her own willpower, felt like a fever dream now, as though she had imagined it all, or as though it had been the beginning of a hallucinatory episode. And yet she was lying on the floor with Shay holding her down, so she had to assume that it had not been a dream or hallucination after all. Yes, she said softly. I am myself. There was a brief moment of hesitation on Shay's part, and then the weight disappeared. Constance slowly pushed herself up on her palms, arms trembling as she sat back and leaned her back against the first pole in the fence that surrounded two sides of the pond. Shay sat crouched next to her, one hand on the hilt of his sword while his gaze warily took in her expression. She brought a hand to her head with a sigh. So she had turned yet again. It seemed that she could successfully bring forth dark Constance at will, then, not that it had been her intention. Not at all. She wished that she could have fled somewhere, to be alone with her own emotions and thoughts, but Shay just continued to stare at her almost as though searching for something. You know, he said, I still know next to nothing about these strange episodes of yours. Have you always had them? Constance looked away. She and Linhard had attempted to keep Shay in the dark as much as possible, including regarding the fact that she was cursed, and so it was natural that he would have questions about it. While she had begun to doubt that he could be an Agarthan spy, she was still hesitant to trust him with any more information than strictly needed. She supposed Hubert would be proud of her, a thought that brought a bittersweet smile to her lips. You know more about my episodes than I do about your transformation, she deflected. She had expected him to leave it at that and change the subject, since he always seemed reluctant to go into his own past, but to her surprise, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair as he sat back on the floor, seeming to actually consider sharing more information with her. I guess, he said quietly, keeping his gaze locked on the floor between them now. To be honest, I don't know half of it myself, and of the things I do know, most of it would probably make you think that I've completely lost it. She studied his dejected expression, trying for the umpteenth time to think of what it could possibly be if not somehow related to those who slither in the dark. He certainly did not seem to be one of Thale's people, but from what she had seen of his powers, it was doubtlessly connected to elder magic somehow. I have seen my fair share of strange things, she said. Hardly anything could surprise me at this point. Yeah, Shay looked up at her, seeming to come to a sudden realization. You're some kind of magical researcher, aren't you? So. Have you ever heard of? He cut himself off, as though remembering that he was supposed to keep quiet. Constance barely dared to breathe, trying her best to look kind and gentle so that he would feel comfortable continuing his question. And apparently he liked what he saw on her face, because his shoulders relaxed slightly. Have you ever heard of someone who's had something awakened inside them? Like, he trailed off, looking conflicted. Constance decided to extend a hand. Some kind of power, perhaps, she asked, distantly wondering whether her and Shay's situations were more similar than she had thought. Had he gone through the elder ritual? Or had he been cursed as well? Shay did not look entirely convinced, but he nodded slowly. I guess you could call it that. It happened suddenly, in the middle of a fight. I was getting my ass handed to me, about to be sliced in half most likely, and something kind of sparked to life and gave me these new powers, which meant that I could fight back and survive. I mean, you've seen my powers in action, they're not exactly normal. Indeed, she said thoughtfully. She did not want to push him too hard, or he might stop being so forthcoming with her, but this truly was an intriguing case. Do you believe it to be some kind of magic, then? He shrugged. I don't know. I've never been good at that kind of thing. And I've never seen anyone else with similar powers. I have, Constance thought immediately. She was confident that she had seen Shay teleport between his foes in the desert, and unless he had been granted his powers by the goddess herself, that could only be explained with elder magic. But if his powers had manifested within him in the middle of a fight, then it seemed unlikely that it was connected to an elder ritual. Unless... Do you know the identity of the person who almost killed you, who awakened these powers within you? Shay looked away. Without a word, he got up on his feet and brushed off his pants. Just some random merc, he said in a short voice. It's not important. Anyway, I thought I should tell you, before you changed, I think you actually made something happen with the water. It splashed up toward your hand, from out of nowhere. Constance gasped. She stood up so quickly that her head spun and she was forced to lean back against the railing with one hand as she waited for oxygen to return to her brain. It truly did. I successfully used Morphean magic. He shrugged. Unless the water suddenly decided on its own that it wanted to shoot up into space, then yeah. She could not help herself, she bounced up and down, clapping her hands as she laughed joyfully. I did it. I am a truly unstoppable force. Nothing can stand in my way when it comes to unraveling the mysteries of magic, nothing. Not even Hubert's forsaken bracelets, she thought contently. Of course, it would have been preferable if she could cast Morphean magic without necessarily needing to go through such a horrible event again, but for now, she would happily take any progress rather than none. Ah, she exclaimed, picking up her things from beside the pond before hurrying toward the door. I shall need to tell Linhard of my achievement. Come to the library. They did not even have a chance to sit down at the table where Linhard and Lysithea had spread out their books before Linhard stood so quickly from his chair that it fell backward with a loud slam. I have discovered something truly revolutionary, he exclaimed, gaze gleaming with excitement as he watched Constance and Shay walk up to the table. Does it have anything to do with the curse? She asked. Not directly, but... Then it can wait. You see, I successfully cast Morphean magic. She raised her chin proudly, smiling down upon him as she waited for his congratulations and odd compliments. But Linhard did not even blink. That's great, he said, sounding as though he had barely even registered what she had just proclaimed. Now sit down and listen to what I found. She let out an affronted gasp. Wah, how dare you? I swear you'll like this, he insisted. Constance glared at him, placing her hands at her sides. He stared back, silently but impatiently. Of course. She should have known. Why would Linhard ever be interested in whether she failed or succeeded in a magical experiment that had nothing to do with his own interests? He had seemed interested in Morphean magic, but when he had failed to achieve results for himself, it had seemed as though he had quickly moved on and lost interest. With a loud sigh, she sat down opposite him before wearily nodding for him to continue. Whatever Linhard had found had better be as revolutionary as he said. Well? What is it then? Most likely, it was something purely crest-related, but seeing how helpful Linhard had been recently, she supposed she could give him some attention while he told her about his new findings. Do you remember what Androtimos said about the Morphean language? That it originated in Fodlan a long time ago. Constance frowned. I do, yes. He drew for breath as if to speak again, then stopped himself to look furtively to his sides before leaning in toward the table and lowering his voice so only the three of them could hear. I believe that the Morphise people are actually distant descendants of the Agarthans. Constance paused, glancing at Shay, who had positioned himself by a bookcase some paces away, looking utterly uninterested. Lysithea, who sat next to Linhard, also seemed unfazed by what he had just posited. And Linhard himself was looking at Constance intently, awaiting her reaction. How could you possibly have come to that conclusion? She asked, confused but nonetheless intrigued by the possibility. Linhard smiled, seeming content that he had captured her attention. We don't know much about what existed before the goddess came to Fodlan, right? All records from that time have been erased, probably by the church themselves. But according to what I've learned from the historical tomes in this library, the Morphi seem to have been part of a nation of humans that existed long before the goddess arrived. And how in the world does that relate to the Agarthans? Just listen, he exclaimed in something of a mix between frustration and eagerness. The original people living in Fodlan were very in tune with nature, and had their own kind of magic that is highly reminiscent of what we have seen in Morpheus so far. They worshipped completely different gods than our goddess, as well. They were gods of sleep, dreams, and death, because that nation of humans saw the loss of consciousness as something that connected them to the higher powers. But then our goddess arrived in Fodlan, and he trailed off. Well, if we're to believe the Morphean history books, she was little more than a colonizer. Constance scoffed. She wished Hubert could have been there to hear that. It would definitely have amused him to hear her described as such. Either way, the original humans tried to fight back to protect their culture, country, and religion. Many of those who fought back at first were apparently slaughtered by the children of the goddess, which angered the survivors. Such a meaningless death was clearly not believed to allow the victims to commune with the gods. So they decided to strike back as hard as they could, and wouldn't you know it, this whole war effort was spearheaded by none other than Thales. "Wait just a moment," Constance exclaimed, holding up a hand. Linhard looked slightly annoyed to have been interrupted, but he did fall silent. Thales? Was this not during the War of Heroes? If he had been active 1,000 years ago, then how could he possibly be alive today? It was, he confirmed, perking up at the mention. I'll get back to that in a moment. But listen to this, the rebels were forced to take cover underground to escape the goddess' wrath, probably in Shamhala or somewhere else like it. Thales appointed a group of mages to experiment with their nature magic, in an attempt to tame and control it so they could use it reliably in their war against the goddess. This was the origin of black magic. But it wasn't strong enough against the goddess and her people, so they took inspiration from faith magic, the magic of their oppressors, and adapted it into their own version. Elder magic, Constance murmured. Dark magic, Linhard said with a nod. Exactly. This part certainly aligned perfectly with what Hubert had told her long ago, when she still knew him as Crow, that an ancient people, the Elders, had adapted faith magic into a twisted magic of their own, and that therefore, Elder magic and faith magic were more similar than most people knew. While black magic was channeled from the outside and in, drawing its power from nature, faith magic and Elder magic worked in the other direction, the most important distinction being that Elder magic worked on complex algebraic formulas rather than faith and prayers. But this is where it becomes really interesting, Linhard continued, pulling back slightly to eagerly browse through an open book before him. There are a lot of mentions of this one man who disagreed with the teachings of the old religion, even before Suthes arrived. As far as I can tell, he was a competent scientist, but most books I've found on the subject describe him as an eccentric outcast who went against the wishes of the gods. He was convinced that life was precious, and strived to overcome death rather than embrace it. Since he was seen as a heathen at the time, he apparently went into hiding and disappeared from the public eye for several years. He stopped on a spread of pages, one of them showing a sketch of a young man's face. Constance leaned forward slightly to see better, but the tome was old and worn, and the sketch was too unclear to make out any discerning details, although she did notice that the man's hair seemed so light it must nearly have been white, just as Thales and Lysias. And just as Lysithea, Constance realized, who seemed completely disinterested still. She had likely heard Linhard tell this story already. Shay, however, did in fact lean in to view the sketched and unclear image, frowning as he did so. She supposed even Shay might appreciate a book as long as it included images. But listen to this, Linhard said, when Thales assumed leadership of the rebel army, he searched out that scientist and recruited him to his cause. According to some sources, they even stood on somewhat equal footing as far as ranks went. Isn't that exciting? That Thales recruited an atheistic scientist to his army, and made him a commander. Constance frowned as she considered this. Yes. That is odd. Especially considering that Thales was still alive today, and yet she had never heard of this scientist commander before. Had he perished in battle? Or had whatever elder ritual Thales must have used to be able to live such a long life not been available for the scientist? Thales clearly saw something in him, but the people who wrote these books didn't appreciate either of them very much. It isn't completely clear what exactly happened next, but as far I understand it, the scientist started experimenting with dark magic, including the blood variant, and invented technology that could be used in the war against the children of the goddess. And then something happened which shook the entire community to its core, something that one source describes as too unholy to speak of. Public opinion was really divided, and eventually, a large group of people who opposed Thales' methods and were beginning to see the futility of fighting a literal goddess and her people left Fodlan and migrated to a new country to Morphise. The ones who remained started calling themselves Agarthans at this point. And since the Church of Syros only really bothered to take over Fodlan, the people who fled to Morphise were left alone and allowed to build up their culture again in a new place. They built this library and started recording all of their history anew, since they had either lost their previous records in the war, or left it behind in Shamhala. But over the centuries, much of the ancient culture has been modernized or adjusted along with the development of the rest of the world. They still have their ancient magic, but the language is far removed from the one they spoke 1,000 years ago. The language, Constance repeated. Do you have any examples of their original language? Linhard browsed a few pages ahead in the book in front of him, then turned it around so that she could read the text. There, printed in the middle of one of the pages, were the familiar swirls and hooks that she remembered having seen both in Shamhala and in the tome that Hubert had used as reference when he performed the elder ritual on her. Yes, she said softly. This is Agarthan. So the language of those who slither in the dark remains the same even 1,000 years later. It makes sense, Linhard said as he turned the book back around. Considering that Thales is still alive today, he would have kept the language alive. Which begs the question, she said. How in the world is he still alive, if he lived during the War of Heroes? Linhard sighed and shook his head. That, I don't know. I've searched for an answer, but the Morphi don't seem to know either. My best guess is that the scientist somehow found a way to grant eternal life in the end, since that seemed to be what he was striving toward. Epimenides, said a smooth voice nearby. All four of them were taken aback by this new addition, turning their heads as Androtimos appeared from behind the nearest set of bookcases. However, Constance distantly registered that out of them all, Shay seemed to react the strongest in odd little detail, seeing that he was usually the first to notice dangers, and so should not have been as surprised. However, this time, it was almost as though he reacted twice, once at the first sound of Androdimos' voice, and then a second time just a brief moment later. Constance kept her gaze on him, watching him frown and mouth something below his breath as Androtimos walked up to their table. However, what Shay said next instantly made her suspicion turn into weariness instead. Bless you. Ugh. Constance exclaimed, rolling her eyes. Clearly that was not a sneeze, Shay. He blinked at her, cheeks slowly growing red. I knew that. With a sigh, Constance turned to face Androtimos, expecting him to smile his usual calm yet amused smile, but his expression could not be more serious. Excuse me? Linhard asked after a moment of silence. Epimenides, Androtimos repeated then, crossing his arms over his chest as he let his gaze slowly move across the books on the table. That was the name of the scientist. It is not a well-known fact, and not a name you will easily find in any of the books in this library. If I may offer you a piece of advice, you should be careful not to speak openly about the ancient history of our people here. Many Morphi consider it a rather sensitive subject, and uttering the Agarthan scientist's name will be met with scorn from most. Yourself included? Constance asked, standing up from the chair and mirroring his pose by crossing her own arms over her chest. He turned his head to look at her, and she bravely met his gaze. While for a few seconds he continued to look as serious as a priest mid-sermon, it only took a moment before his expression relaxed and he granted her a soft smile. Me? Surely not, he assured her, his voice more relaxed now as well. My love for all things historical has, of course, drawn me to the subject of our own gruesome past, whereby my knowledge about Epimenides and his deeds has broadened considerably. How else would I know and freely speak the name of the most prominent heathen in Morphian history? Constance exhaled slowly, keeping her gaze on Androtimos for just a moment longer before uncrossing her arms and seating herself on her chair again. It seemed that, for now at least, he was not considering reporting them to any holy authorities of Morphise. To be quite honest, Androtimos continued more quietly as he sat himself down in a chair next to Linhard, I believe that our hatred for Epimenides, which is passed down from generation to generation, has turned rather hollow at this point. Morpheus is a largely secular country now, and if history had been repeated today, I believe many of us would have admired his dreams of prolonged life for his people rather than scorned them. He paused, smile wavering somewhat. Perhaps not so much the methods by which he intended to reach that dream, I'll readily admit. However, in my eyes, Thales was the most frightful monster of that era, not Epimenides. Constance and Linhard exchanged a look, but of course, Androtimos noticed this right away. Now, he said, raising a finger in the air as he looked between them, I must shamefully confess that I overheard part of your conversation earlier. Most prominently, I seem to recall hearing the words, Thales is still alive today. Constance held her breath, feeling Androdimos' gaze burn into her face. When she momentarily glanced at Linhard, she nearly kicked him under the table. He looked so terrifically guilty that he could just as well have shouted it all out for the entire library to hear. As soon as Androtimos followed her gaze and saw Linhard's expression, his smile grew firm again. On Linhard's other side, Lysithea rolled her eyes, but behind him, Shay seemed to have lost interest in their conversation, as he had leaned his back against a nearby bookcase and was once again frowning as he muttered something inaudible to himself. As I thought, Androtimos said, sounding strangely satisfied with himself. Your purpose for visiting our library was more nefarious than you made it out to be. Constance considered telling him that her purpose for visiting the library had been to find cures for a curse that Androdimos' ancestors had placed on her, but she quickly realized that such a confession might only make him more suspicious and wary of them, especially of her, the cursed one. I was never a part of this, Lysithea said, shaking her head. In fact, I don't understand half of what Linhard's talking about. Really? Linhard turned to face Lysithea with a frustrated grunt. You don't understand half, Lysithea? So you still don't realize that I might have just found a clue to how to solve your problem? She blinked at him, taken aback by his sudden passionate outburst. What? These people, he said firmly but now in hushed tones, tapping the open book with his index finger, this scientist, most likely, invented the dark crest ritual that allows those who slither in the dark to take over other people's bodies. The same crest ritual that is used to initialize people into their group, and that can at least experimentally be used to grant new crests to those people. Here, he paused to glance at Constance, who nodded cautiously as her gaze moved from him to a shocked Lysithea. She had told Linhard about the Elder Ritual in general terms during their journey to Morpheus, after she had realized that he would be several times more useful to her if he had a solid foundation to stand on when it came to the curse and its workings on her. She had never mentioned Lady Edelgard in particular, wanting to respect both her and Hubert's privacy, but she had assumed from Linhard's reaction at the time that his thoughts had traveled there all on his own. And now, hearing this little outburst at Lysithea, she had to wonder. Lysithea was deathly pale, staring at Linhard as though he had just proclaimed that he was death himself come to claim her. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words ever came. So do you see now? Linhard continued, sounding more exhausted than frustrated this time. The more we learn about this ritual, the better our chances at finding a way to revert it. Now it was Constance's turn to stare at Lysithea. Her bright, almost white hair. Her pale eyes. Her incredibly powerful magic. She cut herself off as soon as Lysithea turned her large eyes toward her. Lysithea. Are you perchance a skilled caster of dark magic? Lysithea's mouth fell open further. Well, she supposed that confirmed that. So that meant. Had Lysithea also been exposed to gruesome experiments in the same manner as Lady Edelgard? Had they had another elder magic user in their midst for years, one who had gone through an advanced elder ritual, even without even noticing? Or had Hubert always been aware? Lysithea inhaled a trembling breath, before shaking her head and returning her attention to Linhard, now with a small wrinkle of determination between her eyebrows. You knew. You knew all along. And you didn't say anything. He sighed as he turned back to face the book on the table in front of him. I didn't know, it was simply my best estimate of the situation. It seemed unlikely that the secret organization dedicated to crest experiments and forbidden dark magic would be unrelated to your highly irregular, super-secret crest-related condition which, as it just so happens, is really similar to Edelgard's. I really thought you would catch on at this point, too. That's it was none of your business. It is now. So if you want my help, maybe stop complaining and start listening instead. Lysithea pursed her lips as she continued glaring at the side of his face. However, she did stay silent as Linhard calmly looked at Androtemos, continuing their previous conversation as though nothing had happened. Do you know what happened next? He asked. The downfall of the Agarthan people. Androtemos, clearly a mixture of amused and intrigued, shook his head. I'm afraid not. The Morphean recollection of events ends after the last Morphe left that continent. Anything that happened after that is more of a mystery to me than it seems to be to you. His smile faded again. And speaking of, I believe you still owe me an explanation as to the Thales is still alive part. Do you sincerely mean to tell me that an Agarthan commander from the War of Heroes still walks on this planet? For a long moment, as Androtemos looked between Constance and Linhard waiting for someone to reply, the people around the table were silent. Shay, who was still leaning against the bookcase nearby, had stopped muttering to himself now and was staring at his own shoes. Lysithea had turned her gaze back to her own books, but she seemed too disturbed by what Linhard had told her to be able to return to her studies. Linhard himself looked as he so often did as though he was near falling asleep. Constance lowered her gaze to the book in front of him, where one page was still showing Agarthan words. They had already revealed too much, and Androtemos was too knowledgeable of Agarthan history for them to be able to keep him in the dark. As of yet, he had been very forthcoming and willing to help them however he could, including regarding this particular occurrence. However, introducing yet another person, someone who was still virtually a stranger to the existence of those who slither in the dark and the deeds they had done, seemed rather irresponsible, especially considering how little they still knew about their aims and plans. For all they knew, Androtemos could be an Agarthan spy, recruited by Thales in order to keep an eye on them while they were in Morphais. And yet, if he weren't, he could surely be of great assistance to them in their research, perhaps even in their ultimate aim to defeat Thales for good. She looked up at Androtemos, meeting his gaze. He looked surprisingly patient, but there was a clear request in his gaze as well. And after everything he had done for them so far, shouldn't he expect to be repaid with the same courtesy? What would Hubert do? Frowning, she tried to imagine that Hubert was sitting there beside her, weighing his options. He would be reluctant to trust Androtemos, and for good reason in this case. However, she also felt certain that he would see an opportunity, just as she did, an opportunity to learn more about those who slither in the dark from an inside source, if she may call Androtemos that, with his Morphean heritage and his knowledge of their history. The question was, would it be enough? Or did the fact that he had overheard them mean that he was first and foremost a liability which needed to be dealt with? Would Hubert rather have silenced Androtemos than invited him to work with them? The possibility was high, and to her dismay, Constance realized that she did not have a good enough grasp of Hubert's thought process yet to draw any final conclusions as to how he would have acted. Now, Yuri. Yuri was another issue. Yuri, she was certain, would have strung him along no matter what his ultimate end goal was. He would have found a use for him, now that the opportunity had presented itself. However, he wouldn't share any vital details of his plan with the man, and he would make certain to come up with a contingency plan in case he'd betray them. How was it that she was so well versed in Yuri's thought process that she could easily see what he would have done in any one situation, yet Hubert was still to a large extent a mystery to her? Clearly, she had spent too much time in Yuri's presence in her years in Abyss. That is one possible conclusion, she decided to say eventually, after quickly going through the past 10 minutes or so of her and Linhard's conversation in her head. She would share nothing more than what Androtemos already knew from before or had overheard from their conversation, yet make it seem as though she trusted him with key details. This, she was certain, was what Yuri would have done, and she trusted Yuri much, much more than herself in this kind of situation. That is, unless the man we are speaking of is merely using an ancient name for himself in order to inspire confidence in his underlings. I suppose it depends on how reliable Linhard's sources are, and whether or not this Epimenides who supposedly sought after the gift of eternal life ever succeeded in his endeavors. As she spoke, she made certain to give Linhard a significant glance to have him stay silent. She did not trust him to be discreet. And thankfully, he didn't attempt to compliment her answer or even corroborate it in any way. If he had any true evidence that the Thales from ages past and the Thales of those who slither in the dark were the same man, he did not choose this moment to share it. Androtimos smiled slightly, keeping his gaze closely fixed on her. It was impossible for her to determine what he thought of her response. A very diplomatic answer, Divitiagia Constans, he said. And this secret organization of dark magic users, which I believe you called, those who slither in the dark. Constance clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to give Linhard a glare. If he hadn't revealed all of that to Lysithea just now. Yes, she said with a small huff of annoyance, it would be preferable if you could be discreet regarding that part. Of course, Androtimos said, inclining his head in acknowledgement. I was simply curious about them. If it is true that the members of that organization perform experiments with crests and dark magic, I would assume that they could pose quite a threat to the Faudlane's order of things. Especially if their experiments are based on the work of Epimenides. Constance paused. It was clear that Androtimos was no fool, and that she would need to tread carefully around him. However, what was also becoming more and more clear was that he could prove to be an important resource in their research of those who slither in the dark. He may not know anything about curses, but he clearly knew things about the crest experiments which he had yet to reveal. With him by their side, they might have a better chance at eliminating the dark faction once and for all. Say, Androtimos, Linhard said, and Constance almost snapped at him to be quiet, but he gave her a knowing look that made her hesitate and wait to see what he would say. You don't happen to have any recommendations for further reading on this subject? In particular, on the Agarthan experiments. And if those resources are in Agarthan, I would be more than grateful if you could help us translate. Constance relaxed somewhat. It seemed that Linhard had followed the same line of thought as she had, perhaps she needn't have worried about him. Even Lysithea was awakened from her stupor by Linhard's question. She straightened in her chair, turning toward Androtimos with large, pleading eyes. Please, Timos? This may be my only chance to find a solution to the problem that brought me to your great library. Androtimos sighed slightly, but it was clearly a fond sigh. With a smile, he stood from his chair. Wait here, I will bring you some of our most ancient tomes. However, be warned that even for me, they are heavy reads. It will take time to translate them all. Lysithea clapped her hands together in gratitude, her eyes gleaming with hope. Thank you, Timos. Truly. He gave a short bow to her before disappearing around the corner of a nearby bookcase. After his steps had faded away, Constance faced Linhard with a weary smile. Well, she said as she too stood from her chair. It seems that you have a long night ahead of you. If you do learn anything new regarding curses, be sure to inform me. What about you? Linhard asked immediately, sounding annoyed. You're not staying. She let out a short laugh. Me? Oh, Linhard, she said, shaking her head as she gathered her things, then nodded toward Shay. He pushed off from the bookcase and sauntered over toward the staircase. I have complete faith in your capabilities, and I am sure that Hubert will be pleasantly surprised to hear about your work ethic, whatever results you may produce from this endeavor. However, it is wholly unnecessary for us both to spend valuable time on this particular research. Therefore, I shall continue dedicating myself to researching the subject of Morphean magic, a field which will surely benefit the whole of Adrestia when I have succeeded in unraveling its mysteries. Linhard sighed heavily. Fine, he muttered, waving her away. Go back to splashing in the pond while I uncover the secrets of our most lethal enemy. He yawned. Perhaps I'll just take a short nap first. Constance scoffed, rolling her eyes as she turned her back on him and Lysithea. Well, she supposed she shouldn't complain, at least Linhard had been taking much fewer naps recently. Darkness already held the capital city of Adrestia in a firm grip when the cowled man stepped through the door of the Heaping Goblet. His gaze swept casually over the room once, his long cloak swaying around his lower legs as he walked past the first couple of tables, where a dozen sailors and construction workers were just starting their second round of drinks. He gestured with 3 combined fingers toward the bartender, who nodded and went into the back rooms as she threw a towel across her shoulder. He seated himself by one of the tables further back in a corner, outside the reach of the brighter lamps, with a wide view of the entire bar. Apart from the workers by the tables near the door, There was a table with 3 men drinking and speaking softly with each other in another corner, and then a table hosting the bartender's 2 sons, who were busy playing cards with each other. But the night had only just begun, and as he leaned back in his seat, the door opened and another group of workers entered. They loudly greeted their companions by the first few tables before pulling up chairs to seat themselves in the midst of the ruckus. This was the highlight of their entire week. They wouldn't bother to be quiet, which suited him perfectly. The bartender returned from the back rooms, arriving at his table with a mug of ale, and a note slipped from her sleeve into his palm as she gave him a friendly handshake. "Good to see ya again," she said, fixing him with her discerning gaze. "How's the trip?" "Let's say, it was enlightening," he muttered, concealing the note beneath his palm. The hefty woman let out a quiet huff as she withdrew her hand and crossed her arms over her chest, glancing briefly toward her sons. "Yeah, don't say," she murmured, turning back to face him again. "And the family? They miss ya, do ya think?" "Who's to say? Do they know you're coming home early?" He raised the mug to his lips, studying the workers while he thought. As the bottom of the mug met with the table again, he replied, "I suspect they do." She sighed heavily, shaking her head as she knocked her fist against the table 3 times. "Well, last night of freedom. Enjoy your drink." As the bartender sauntered back behind the bar, he casually moved his right hand to the mug, lowering his gaze to the sparse message on the note as he turned up his palm. It was a series of symbols, a row of 7 vertical lines with 2 horizontal bars across, followed by the letter W, 3 arrows in various directions, the number 7 and 2 simple drawn hands in different shapes. He read it over 3 times, then after he'd memorized it, he discreetly brought the note behind the table and burned it in his closed fist. As a thin trail of smoke escaped between his gloved fingers, the front door opened again. Hubert raised the mug to his lips again as he watched 3 men in anonymous clothing walk inside. One of them stayed near the door, leaning in to talk to the workers, another walked up to the counter and ordered a beer, and the third, a familiar face, let his gaze move across the room once before making his way to Hubert's table. As he sat down, he inclined his head in greeting. As Hubert nodded back, he returned his right hand above the table, absently tapping 3 fingers against its surface. The other man quietly cleared his throat, scooting his chair closer to the table. Then he leaned back in his seat as he gazed toward the table in the other corner, running a hand through his short black hair. Hubert paused his own movements briefly. Not the correct pattern. Crossing his arms over his chest, he leaned back as well. "Long time no see," he said. "Everything well?" The other man looked back at him with some measure of disinterest. "Can't complain. You?" "Well," he sighed, allowing his gaze to subtly take in the room again. The man who'd stopped by the first table had straightened again, and was now leaning back against the wall next to the door as he watched the games currently being played by a group of sailors by the table nearby. The shape of a sword glimpsed below his long coat. As for the man by the bar, he had just received his beer, and seemed to be talking to the bartender. "I'm looking forward to a good, long rest. Here. Do you still work Saturdays?" The man nodded, mirroring Hubert's pose by crossing his own arms over his chest. "Up at 6. 45 minutes to walk. 10 hours of work. 5 mouths to feed, and then barely a night's sleep, and it starts all over again." Hubert didn't bother to memorize the apparent code, knowing that it wouldn't matter at this point. "And still, you have time to waste here?" he asked as he glanced toward the bartender, carefully considering his options. The other man just looked at him for a moment. Then, the dawn of a smile appeared on his lips. "Just one drink." Hubert straightened in his seat, reaching forward to grab his own mug in what he hoped was a movement casual enough not to rouse the other man's suspicion. "You'll have to entertain yourself, then," he said as he raised the mug to drink up the last of his ale. "There's somewhere I need to be." As he sat the mug down again, a hand darted forward and gripped his wrist. It happened so quickly, yet in such a smooth movement, that Hubert could only freeze in place as he felt his magical reserves drain and a familiar weariness come over him. He clenched his jaw as he stared into the eyes of the other man, the man with the stolen face, who was now wearing an amused smirk. "Why leave so soon?" he asked, his voice taking on a mocking lilt. "It's been so long since we last saw each other, I am dying to hear about your travels. Hubert glanced out toward the room. Both men who had arrived together with his companion were clearly watching him now, all pretenses dropped. Even if he could be fast enough to bring out a dagger before the other man could react, he would quickly be overwhelmed, and without his magic, the battle would be lost before it had even begun. Besides, he couldn't know whether there were more than the three of them there, perhaps some had even been waiting there for him before he arrived. Returning his gaze to the man sitting opposite him, he made himself relax his muscles. "Hello, Lysias," he said calmly. The other man lowered his head slightly, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement as his smirk widened into a grin. "Hello again, Hubert," he said. "Or should I say, welcome home. Check the description for the links to the author."